On this channel, I typically endeavor to build positive arguments for theism and Christianity and then answer objections to those arguments. This is because I regard this as being the most important task of the Christian apologist. However, I have come to see that there is a need to address what I see as being poor or insufficient arguments for theism and for Christianity. The reasons for this are manifold, but the two most important are the following. First, quality is to be preferred over quantity. It is better for the apologist to have only 3 or 4 strong arguments than to have 10 or 20 poor arguments. We do not make a better case for Christian theism by adding any and all arguments for Christianity to our repertoire, regardless of their quality. We should be at least as skeptical of the arguments for our own beliefs as we are of the arguments against them. While this practice of scrutinizing the arguments on our own side ultimately means that we will have fewer arguments in our arsenal, it also means that the arguments which survive this critical scrutiny will be much stronger and more defensible. In other words, being skeptical of the arguments for theism and Christianity helps us to sharpen our critical thinking skills, to weed out the bad arguments, and to have a stronger overall case for Christian theism in the end. Second, it is important for those of us who are within the Christian apologetics community to be willing to acknowledge the problems with the arguments on our side. Why? It comes down to the simple fact that other Christian apologists, who may be prone to using these problematic arguments, will be more open to our criticisms. Their defenses, so to speak, will not be up as strongly because they won't perceive us as being a threat to their faith. We serve as an example that it is possible to keep the faith without embracing whatever argument with which the other apologist may be enamored. Christian apologists will often be much more willing to listen to criticisms of their arguments from their fellow apologists than they might be from others. Furthermore, showing some skepticism toward apologetic arguments is important for our testimony as apologists to unbelievers. It shows them that we are thinking through our faith for ourselves. We are trying to be honest with the evidence, and we are not embracing arguments just because the conclusions agree with our beliefs. It is because of these two considerations that I will be criticizing several of the arguments which are popular among Christian apologists in this series. My criticisms are intended to be constructive. It is my hope that this causes apologists to use better arguments in their case for Christianity and to avoid weaker arguments. With all that being said, I will now introduce the topic of this video, namely why I don't use the moral argument for God's existence. Immediately there is a problem with how I have titled this video because the term, the moral argument, is misleading since it implies that there is only one such argument. In fact, there is an entire family of moral arguments. Moreover, this family can be divided into 2 categories of arguments: deductive moral arguments and abductive moral arguments. In this video, I shall lay out 5 general problems for moral arguments for theism, which I will then proceed to apply to both deductive and abductive moral arguments. I shall not in this video devote much time to moral knowledge arguments for theism, although, as will become clear, some of my criticisms of moral arguments apply equally to moral knowledge arguments. As such, I will not be discussing the work of Angus Ritchie in his excellent book, From Morality to Metaphysics, despite the rigor and sophistication of his argument, since I consider his argument to be a moral knowledge argument for theism. I will, nevertheless, have something to say about moral epistemology near the beginning and end of this video. So what exactly is a moral argument? Well, very roughly stated, moral arguments attempt to show that moral realism either entails or at least justifies theism. But we will need to back up and discuss precisely what we mean by moral realism. First, I need to discuss the terms I'm using and why. If you have read much of the popular material on Christian apologetics, then you are probably familiar with the terms objective morality and subjective morality. In this video, I will be avoiding these terms whenever possible. I will attempt to use the terms moral realism, moral anti-realism, and moral skepticism for several reasons. First, this is how philosophers who specialize in ethics and metaethics tend to speak. Inasmuch as I will be quoting extensively from specialists in metaethics throughout this video, It will help me to be consistent in my use of terms, to adopt the standard academic verbiage rather than the popular apologetic terminology. This is not to say that the term objective morality does not appear at all in the literature. It is just to say that moral realism is the standard way of referring to this concept. Second, and more importantly, moral realism is a much clearer term than objective morality. This is because terms like moral realism and anti-realism have reasonably well understood definitions, whereas the terms objective and subjective do not. The distinction between what is objective and what is subjective varies quite widely to the point that it can be used to distinguish between concepts as distinct as what is real versus what is not, as well as what is public versus what is private. Something which is private, such as a phenomenal experience or an idea, can still be real. Thus, it can be objective in one sense and subjective in another. Moreover, the term objective morality has the tendency to create a false dichotomy according to which the only alternative to objective morality is subjective morality. But that is clearly not so. One could, for example, think that morality does not exist at all, or that the very term is meaningless, such that it doesn't even make sense to speak about morality existing. Consequently, despite its popularity among apologists, I will make a conscious attempt to avoid these terms in this video. Having established the reasons for using the term moral realism, we are now in a position to define this term. In this video, I will be using the term moral realism to mean the thesis that there are stance-independent moral facts and or obligations. As Russ Schaefer-Landau explains, the way I would prefer to characterize the realist position is by reference to its endorsement of the stance independence of moral reality. Realists believe that there are moral truths that obtain independently of any preferred perspective, in the sense that the moral standards that fix the moral facts are not made true by virtue of their ratification from within any given actual or hypothetical perspective. That a person takes a particular attitude towards a putative moral standard is not what makes that standard correct. The idea of stance independence is best understood in contrast to mind independence. Many accounts of what it means for something to be real define realism in terms of mind independence. There is some intuitive plausibility to such an understanding. We would want to say that things such as rocks and trees and cars and apples are all real. Moreover, such objects have in common the property that they would exist even if minds did not. They are mind independent. These sorts of objects stand in contrast to paradigm examples of unreal things, such as dreams and hallucinations, which depend essentially upon the existence of minds. They are mind-dependent. However, it becomes clear that such an analysis will not work in the case of paradigm cases of moral facts. Some examples here include the putative fact that it is wrong to murder people, or that one ought not cause unjustified psychological trauma or unjustified physical pain. Yet a little reflection will show that murder cannot occur if there are no minds, nor can psychological trauma or pain. Moral facts, therefore, seem to apply very often, if not always, to minds. As such, they cannot be mind-independent. But moral realists understand moral facts to hold independently of what anyone thinks or believes or prefers or is predisposed towards. These sorts of attitudes are known as stances. The idea behind stance independence is that murder is wrong even if everyone thinks that it is right. One ought not steal from others even if they think that they should. The common property, then, is that moral facts and obligations hold independently of anyone's stances. As such, they are to be understood as being stance-independent rather than mind-independent. As Kevin DeLapp explains, moral realism equals the view that moral values exist in a way that is causally and evidentially, though not conceptually, independent from the beliefs of anyone and everyone, including idealized agents, such that evidence and beliefs do not determine or constitute those values, though they may adequately and reliably measure or reflect them. David Brink agrees, saying, "Not only does ethics concern matters of facts, it concerns facts that hold independently of anyone's beliefs about what is right and wrong." It will also be helpful to distinguish between moral facts and moral obligations. As Adam Johnson explains, in moral theory, it's important to distinguish between moral value, what's good and bad, and moral duty, what's right and wrong, because in some situations, only one or the other applies. For example, there are actions that would be morally good for me to do, such as building an orphanage or developing a cure for cancer, but it's not necessarily my moral duty to do such actions. Moral value and moral duty are closely connected, but because there are important distinctions between them, moral theorists often attempt to provide separate explanations for them. Similarly, Jerry Walls and David Baggett say, not everything that is morally good is also morally right in the sense of being morally obligatory. Giving half of your income to the poor might be morally good, but it likely is not your moral obligation. This will become important later because, as we shall see, certain moral arguments only attempt to make use of moral obligations as opposed to both moral facts and moral obligations. The first challenge which I want to raise for moral arguments concerns their essential dependence upon the thesis of moral realism. This may come as a surprise to many viewers given my own Christian commitments, but in my estimation, the evidence for moral realism is not very good. Moreover, I don't think that Christianity entails a commitment to moral realism. That is to say, I believe that one can fully affirm the doctrines of the Christian faith without affirming the existence of stance-independent moral facts and obligations. Now, I'm sure that many of my viewers are curious how that is possible, but my explanation will take us well beyond the purpose of this video, which is to assess the merits of moral arguments for theism. Moreover, one need not abandon moral realism in order to recognize this weakness in moral arguments. Suffice to say that if one's belief in moral realism is based solely on their prior Christian beliefs, then they will be unable to use those beliefs to justify the moral realist premises of their moral argument to an atheist or skeptic. One can be a moral realist because they think that Christianity entails moral realism, while acknowledging that the independent evidence for moral realism is weak. It is important to realize that I am not here arguing that moral realism is false. I am merely arguing that it is unjustified. And inasmuch as moral arguments for theism are supposed to yield justification for the proposition that God exists, to the extent that they rely upon a premise which is unjustified, they will fail to justify their theistic conclusions. As such, I will not be offering or defending any arguments against moral realism. Instead, I will simply be offering defeaters for the major justifications which have been offered in favor of moral realism. I take what follows to serve as an undercutting defeater for moral realism and, by extension, a critical premise of all moral arguments for theism. Since this video is primarily intended to assess the merits of moral arguments for theism, and not the arguments for moral realism, I will have to keep this section somewhat short. Consequently, I cannot assess every argument for moral realism, nor can I even discuss all of the literature surrounding the ones which I will discuss. Nevertheless, I hope that my brief discussion of some popular arguments for moral realism will at least motivate apologists who are sympathetic to this argument to not just take moral realism as a given. I hope that if nothing else, it will spur them to do some work to defend this premise. In this video, I will consider 4 different approaches which have been attempted to justify belief in moral realism. These are roughly appeals to epistemic reliabilism or epistemic externalism more generally, appeals to moral intuition or seemings, partners in crime style arguments, and the deliberative indispensability argument. Due to the aforementioned constraints on this section of the video, I am forced to interact with a very limited selection of the defenses of moral realism. I have chosen Russ Schaefer Landau, Michael Huemer, Terence Quaino, and David Enoch, respectively, as my interlocutor for each of the arguments, as each of these thinkers is regarded as a prominent defender of each of these justifications. It is safe to say that a great many contemporary philosophers do not think that any arguments are needed for one to be warranted in believing in moral realism. After all, justification cannot go on forever, otherwise no beliefs would ever be justified. So as long as justification has to terminate somewhere, there will be beliefs which are justified or warranted, but they will not owe that status to other beliefs. These sorts of beliefs are called properly basic or non-inferentially justified beliefs. In epistemology, there are roughly two views on the location of the justification or warrant for these types of beliefs: internalism and externalism. According to externalists, justification or warrant depends at least in part upon factors which are external to the subject's own mind and which lie beyond the purview of his own awareness. Put differently, externalists believe that one can be warranted in believing some proposition to be true apart from being aware of any reasons which support this belief. Now, it's important to remember that externalists are not saying that there are no reasons which support their basic beliefs. They are merely saying that one need not always be aware of them. So, for example, the externalists might say that they are warranted in believing that their senses are reliable sources of information, even though they cannot give you a non-circular argument for that conclusion, just as long as it is, in fact, the case that their senses are reliable. In this case, there is a reason why the belief is warranted, namely the fact that their senses actually are reliable, but the externalist lacks access or awareness of that reason. Internalism is the antithesis of externalism. Internalists maintain that there is an awareness requirement, or at least a potential awareness requirement, on justification. That is to say, a proposition is only justified for me if I am aware of some reason in virtue of which I can rationally believe that the proposition is true. An example here might be the belief that my friend is going to come over for dinner later today, being justified by the fact that my friend accepted my invitation to do so. The justification for that belief depends upon my friend making me aware that they were going to come over. For internalists, all beliefs require this sort of awareness. Given these two options, moral realists have tried to find ways in which moral beliefs can be properly basic, which are acceptable to either internalists or to externalists. Russ Schaefer-Landau is a good example of someone who has contended that moral realism is warranted on externalist grounds. He refers to his position as moral reliabilism. He begins by defining what he means by reliabilism. The basic idea behind any form of reliabilism is that the epistemic status of a belief depends crucially on the way it came about. As a first pass, a process is reliable just in case it produces more true beliefs than false ones. A conditionally reliable process is one that produces more true than false beliefs when the relevant cognitive operation begins with true beliefs. Reliabilism allows for the possibility of non-inferential warrant because it allows for the possibility of reliable processes that do not involve inferring some beliefs from others. And he goes on to apply this to the notion of moral beliefs, saying, "My thought is that rather than look to the content of grounding and verdictive beliefs and then seek to establish some deductive, inductive, or other kind of evidential relation, we should shift our focus to the sorts of successful processes that get us from a variegated, disparate battery of grounding beliefs to firm, settled, verdictive moral beliefs. These processes may be reliable even if there is no kind of inferential relation that transmits justification from the grounding beliefs to verdictive moral beliefs. I am drawn to this sort of account because of the promise it offers in solving the problem of how we might gain epistemic access to particular moral facts. It also does quite a good job of answering the skeptical worries we have encountered. For instance, the justification of a verdictive moral belief needn't be traced back to some other belief, itself in need of justification, but instead might terminate in a citation of the reliable process through which the belief was formed. If Schaefer-Landau is right, then moral realists need not offer any arguments or indeed any justification at all for their belief in moral realism. Instead, they can simply say that the belief was brought about by a reliable cognitive process. Such a move quite easily removes any burden of proof from the moral realist, but it comes at a significant cost. An initial worry is that one could say this about any belief at all. If asked why one believes that the earth is flat, or that the Book of Mormon is true, or that the Great Pumpkin exists, one could always lazily answer by saying that the belief was brought about by a reliable cognitive process. And since the reliabilist wants to make the reliable process itself the stopping point of justification, we are left with no way of saying that any of our basic beliefs are more rational than belief in a flat earth or in the Great Pumpkin. And naturally enough, this raises the question as to why one should think that their cognitive processes are reliable in the first place. All that reliabilism can say is that if one's cognitive faculties are reliable, then the beliefs which they produce will usually be true. But it offers no assurance whatsoever that this is actually the case, and, by the very nature of the theory itself, it cannot do so. One can hope that their beliefs have been reliably produced, but they cannot have any reason for thinking so. How does Schaefer-Landau address these challenges? His answer amounts to a bare assertion that there is just no alternative. He says, at bottom, worries about epistemic externalism have centrally to do with its willingness to countenance a sort of opacity among justified believers. Many think it crucially important that a knower somehow be aware, or be capable of becoming aware, of the justifiers that confer positive epistemic status on her beliefs. Yet, however natural and intuitively attractive such a requirement may seem, it is unacceptable on any of its most plausible construals. Notice that Schaefer-Landau has done nothing to avoid these concerns. He offers no way to block a person from saying that their belief in the Great Pumpkin is warranted as long as it was produced by a reliable process, nor does he offer any assurance for the person who doubts that their cognitive faculties are actually reliable at all. He simply asserts that internalism is unacceptable. He offers no explanation as to why internalism should be thought to be unacceptable, but even if he was right about that, why isn't his externalism likewise unacceptable based upon these challenges? Schaefer-Landau's proposal amounts to nothing more than assuming that one's moral beliefs have been reliably produced, and if that unjustified assumption is true, then these beliefs have a better than not chance of being true. I submit that this is a most unsatisfying account of moral knowledge. Indeed, to the extent that one thinks that knowledge requires one to be in possession of a reason to believe as they do, this is not knowledge at all. It is merely wishful thinking. On the internalist side, Michael Huemer has attempted to provide an account of how moral realism can be justified without relying upon things like reliable processes. Huemer defends a thesis which he calls ethical intuitionism, which he links to a more general epistemology known as phenomenal conservatism. He explains, the way things seem prior to reasoning we may call an initial appearance. An initial intellectual appearance is an intuition. That is, an intuition that P is a state of it seeming to one that P that is not dependent on inference from other beliefs and that results from thinking about P. Huemer's thesis differs from Schaefer-Landau's in an important way, namely that the believer is aware of something to which they are appealing for justification. While Schaefer-Landau's moral reliabilism amounts to little more than effectively assuming that one's own moral beliefs are true, Huemer's ethical intuitionism purports to provide a reason to believe that moral propositions are true, that reason being one's intuitions that they are true. This is much more satisfying than Schaefer-Landau's account, but aren't intuitions sometimes misleading? Shouldn't this fact make us look elsewhere for justification for our beliefs? It is important to realize that Huemer does not take intuitions to be infallible. They can, in principle, be defeated by additional evidence, so they only provide prima facie evidence for moral truths, and this, he thinks, helps him to avoid objections to his theory based upon the fallibility of intuitions and the possibility that intuitions can be misleading. As he explains, intuition should not be embraced uncritically, and conflicting intuitions should be weighed against each other, taking into account our best judgments as to their relative reliability. My own form of intuitionism holds only that some moral beliefs are rendered prima facie justified by intuitions. Elsewhere, he formalizes his intuitionist theory of phenomenal conservatism as follows. If it seems to S that P, then, in the absence of defeaters, S thereby has at least some degree of justification for believing that P. While Hume's admission that intuitions are fallible helps him escape a first-order objection to his theory based upon clear examples where intuitions mislead us, this admission raises a second-order objection. Specifically, it raises a question as to how we can adjudicate between misleading and truth-directed intuitions. But for Hume, there is nothing more basic than intuition. In other words, there is nothing further to which one can appeal in order to adjudicate between intuitions to weed out the misleading ones. But epistemic justification is supposed to do precisely that. It is supposed to differentiate beliefs which are true, or at least probably true, from beliefs which are false, or at least probably false. And if one is not willing to admit of more basic forms of justification than potentially misleading intuitions, then their theory of epistemic justification actually fails to do the very thing which a theory of epistemic justification is supposed to do. And since we are left with no way to tell when an intuition is not misleading, this raises an even more serious question for Hume. If intuitions do not always indicate truth, why think that they ever do? Hume responds to these sorts of worries as follows. What happens if we apply the principle generally? We need positive reasons for trusting appearances. Then we need positive reasons for trusting sense perception, memory, introspection, and even reason itself. The result is global skepticism. Nothing can be accepted until we first give a positive reason for trusting that kind of belief. But we cannot give such a reason without relying on sense perception, memory, introspection, reason, or in general on some source. This is really quite a baffling answer to give. Hume is actually refusing to give us any reason to think that intuitions are usually truth indicative. His retort amounts to little more than saying that if one doesn't get to just assume some epistemic principles without non-question begging justification, then global skepticism follows. But so what? Why is Hume assuming the falsity of global skepticism from the start? Perhaps global skepticism is true and none of our beliefs can be justified. One can't just assume that intuitions can provide justification because we can't know anything without them. Hume is just making an argument from consequence here and dodging the challenge to his epistemology. But more fundamentally, how is Hume making the leap from the premise that all of our beliefs require positive justification to the conclusion of global skepticism? This just does not follow at all. In my own video series on epistemology, I explained my own theory of epistemic justification by direct acquaintance, which both defeats global skepticism and also doesn't bottom out infallible intuitions. I refer interested viewers there for an alternative to phenomenal conservatism, which avoids this problem. But the salient point is that until Hume actually provides a way of determining when intuitions are misleading and when they are not, his theory is failing to do what a theory of epistemic justification is supposed to do, namely to provide a way of separating true or probably true beliefs from false or probably false beliefs. But Hume is not finished yet. He claims that it would be self-defeating to deny that intuitions can confer justification. After all, if one rejects intuitionism, then it surely must seem to them as though intuitionism is false. But in such a case, Hume contends, they are rejecting the justificatory status of intuitions on the basis of an intuition. So ultimately, one cannot avoid relying on intuitions. He says, an argument has force only to the extent that its premises seem true and seem to support its conclusion. Intellectual inquiry presupposes phenomenal conservatism in the sense that such inquiry proceeds assuming things are the way they appear. Even the arguments of a philosophical skeptic who says we aren't justified in believing anything rests upon the skeptic's own beliefs, which are based upon what seems to the skeptic to be true. This indicates, in brief, why I take any denial of phenomenal conservatism to be self-defeating. But Hume has just clearly confused the mere presence of an intuition with that intuition forming the basis for one's rejection of phenomenal conservatism. It is quite right to say that phenomenal conservatism seems false to me, but this is not why I purport to be justified in rejecting phenomenal conservatism. The basis of my rejecting phenomenal conservatism has nothing to do with how it seems to me, and everything to do with the arguments against it, specifically the aforementioned failure of the theory to do what a theory of epistemic justification is supposed to do. Seemings may typically, or even always, accompany epistemic justification, but this just does not entail that those seemings are themselves justifiers. As John DePoe correctly says, yes, the self-defeat argument seems to be false by my lights, but this is no reason to think that the justification, or even the basis for my belief, is this seeming state. As a contingent feature of the way human biology or psychology is constituted, it could be the case that seemings accompany psychological states with sufficiently strong evidential connections that hold between beliefs and their evidence. Without further argument, however, it would be too hasty to infer from this that seemings are doing any epistemically relevant work. One of the more interesting arguments for moral realism in recent memory is the so-called partners in guilt argument. According to this argument, moral facts and epistemic facts share a sufficient number of properties such that if moral facts do not exist, then neither do epistemic facts. There are several ways of formulating this argument, but most philosophers think that Terence Quaino has developed the most sophisticated version of the argument in his 2007 book, The Normative Web. As such, and since my time is limited, I will adopt Quaino as my interlocutor for this argument. Quaino formulates his argument as follows. 1. If moral facts do not exist, then epistemic facts do not exist. 2. Epistemic facts exist. 3. So, moral facts exist. 4. If moral facts exist, then moral realism is true. 5. So, moral realism is true. By epistemic facts, Quaino means facts about what one ought to believe given their epistemic situation. For example, one ought not believe a proposition without sufficient evidence, or one ought to believe the conclusion of a sound argument. He explains, I will assume that epistemic facts are authoritative in the following twofold sense. They are authoritative in the first place insofar as they are prescriptive, that is to say, epistemic facts are, imply, or indicate reasons for properly situated agents to behave in certain ways. It appears, for example, to be a conceptual truth that if a certain plan of inquiry is manifestly irrational, then its being irrational provides appropriately situated persons with an epistemic reason not to engage in it. The second sense in which epistemic facts are authoritative is that some such facts inescapably govern our conduct. The fundamental idea in this case is that some epistemic facts are, imply, or indicate categorical reasons for agents to behave in certain ways. As such, these facts are, imply, or indicate reasons for agents to behave in certain ways, regardless of whether these agents care about conducting their behavior in a rational way. So right off the bat, we can see that Quaino's use of the term epistemic facts is quite misleading. If one denies the second premise of his argument, according to which epistemic facts exist, this can give off the impression that they are denying that any facts whatsoever about knowledge exist. This would amount to a denial of knowledge, and hence an acceptance of complete epistemic skepticism. But that is not what he means. Instead, he is referring to a very specific type of fact, namely facts about what people ought to believe or ought not to believe, independently of their own goals and desires, given their epistemic situation. It's important to see that it's not immediately obvious that denying that there are stance-independent epistemic obligations will commit one to epistemic skepticism. For example, I can still know a proposition, in the sense of having a justified true belief, based upon a sound argument, even if there is no stance-independent obligation for me to believe the conclusion of the argument. And this is not the same as saying that there is no obligation whatsoever to believe the conclusion of a sound argument. Suppose that I adopt the stance that I want to believe true propositions. This stance will create an obligation for me to believe the conclusion of an argument which I have recognized to be sound. But remove that stance from the picture. Suppose that I don't care about holding beliefs because they are true. It becomes unclear why I should believe the conclusion of a sound argument. The point here is just to emphasize that denying the second premise of Quaino's argument is not as extreme as it might seem at first. Denying the existence of epistemic facts is not a denial of the existence of knowledge. So let's evaluate Quaino's argument. I am happy to grant that the last three premises follow if the first two are true. I will be questioning Queno's justification for supposing premises 1 and 2 to be true. The first premise states that if moral facts do not exist, then epistemic facts do not exist. Why should one think that this is true? Queno's defense of this premise is puzzling to say the least. He spends the second chapter of his book detailing several parallels and similarities between moral facts and epistemic facts, and I'm happy to grant him those parallels for the sake of argument. But in chapter 3 of the book, he seeks to offer a direct justification for his first premise. He explains, I argue that there is a class of objections standardly employed to argue against moral realism, such that, were they to establish that moral facts do not exist, they would also, when suitably modified, establish that epistemic facts do not exist. According to the standard objections, the objectionable features are what render moral facts queer. If moral facts do not exist, then this is wholly because they would display these features. But presumably, there is nothing unique to moral facts that makes their having these features objectionable. It is the features themselves that render moral facts philosophically unacceptable. If this is right, then we can agree that if moral facts do not exist, then nothing has the objectionable features. However, we also know that if epistemic facts exist, then there is something that has the objectionable features. Put differently, we know that if nothing has the objectionable features, then epistemic facts do not exist. And from these two claims, it follows that the core argument's first premise is true. If moral facts do not exist, then epistemic facts do not exist. This defense of the first premise is bizarre to say the least, for it depends entirely upon the skeptic of moral realism basing their skepticism upon certain features of moral facts. I can agree with Queno that if one rejects the existence of moral facts on the basis of their having the same features as epistemic facts, then one must reject the existence of moral facts as well. But after establishing this, Queno makes the curious statement that these arguments exhaust the objections to moral realism. However, this is surely not the only reason one could have for rejecting the existence of moral facts, or even just for being skeptical of their existence. My own reservations about moral realism are not based upon the queerness of such facts, but upon the total lack of evidence for the existence of such facts. So I can agree with him that moral facts are not non-existent because of any particularly objectionable features which they might have. But I could have any number of other reasons for thinking that they don't exist, or just for doubting their existence. And this does not have to be the case for epistemic facts. I could, theoretically, have fantastic evidence for the existence of epistemic facts, which I do not have for the existence of moral facts. Therefore, it does not follow that the existence of epistemic facts somehow entails the existence of moral facts. All that Queno establishes in the third chapter of his book is that if one rejects the existence of moral facts on the basis of some perceived objectionable feature, then he will have to reject epistemic facts for the same reason. As a defensive move against certain objections to moral realism, and assuming that the objector wants to retain the existence of epistemic facts within their ontology, then Queno's move is perfectly valid. As an argument for moral realism, however, this simply will not work, since one can be skeptical of moral realism for other reasons. In short, Queno does not come anywhere near to establishing that epistemic facts cannot exist if moral facts do not. But what about the second premise of the argument? What reason is there to think that there are epistemic facts in the sense of stance-independent facts about what one ought to believe given certain epistemic circumstances? Well, Queno claims that the skeptic of this premise can fall into one of three camps: epistemic nihilism, epistemic expressivism, and epistemic reductionism. Queno defines epistemic nihilism as the thesis that, if there are any epistemic facts, they are as the realist says, and there are no such facts. Queno then proceeds to detail a dilemma for epistemic nihilism. My own sympathies are closer to what Queno labels epistemic expressivism. However, much of Queno's discussion is dedicated to showing that epistemic expressivism is committed to the same ontology as epistemic nihilism. Therefore, epistemic expressivism incurs the same problems as epistemic nihilism. Consequently, It will be worth spending some time addressing Queno's objections to epistemic nihilism, because if his arguments here don't have any bite, then they will equally fail against epistemic expressivism. He begins by presenting a dilemma for epistemic nihilism. Either epistemic nihilism is self-defeating, and hence we have no sufficient reason to believe it, or it implies that there are no epistemic reasons, and a fortiori, we have no reason to believe it. But why should one think that epistemic nihilism is self-defeating if one has reasons to believe it? According to Queno, either epistemic nihilists hold that we have reasons to believe epistemic nihilism, or that we do not. If epistemic nihilists hold that we have reasons to believe their position, then their position is self-defeating in the sense that it presupposes the existence of the very sorts of entities which it claims does not exist. After all, if we have reasons to believe epistemic nihilism, then it follows, by conceptual necessity, that we rationally ought, all other things being equal, to believe it. One wonders how Queno has made the leap from one having a reason to believe a proposition is true to them being obligated, independently of their own stances, to believe it to be true. He claims that this follows as a matter of conceptual necessity, but indeed, he does no work to show this entailment. Perhaps a more charitable reading of Queno will take into account his qualification that one rationally ought to believe it, yielding the interpretation that in order to be rational, one must believe in accordance with what they have reason to believe to be true. However, notice that under this reading, the ought becomes purely descriptive. It amounts to saying that believing in accordance with truth-directed reasons is a necessary condition for being rational. This is true by definition as far as I'm concerned. Kane B gives a rather good explanation of this, saying,
I don't think the skeptic, the moral skeptic, would need to prescribe the duty of pursuing reason and truth, right? It's enough that people just do happen to, value holding true beliefs. So as long as we have the goal of acquiring true beliefs, then we can ask what the best method of acquiring true beliefs is, and then we can say, okay, given this goal of acquiring true beliefs, right, there are certain ways in which we ought to proceed. But yeah, there's no need to suppose that we have to be prescribing, right, certain fundamental goals, right? People just have whatever basic goals they do have, and that can be that. Now, as it happens, I do think that we can give reasons for pursuing truth. I mean, truth has some fairly obvious instrumental values, at least in particular contexts. Maybe not so much in the context of a debate about metaethics, but yeah, I mean, there are certain situations where it's valuable to know the truth because that helps you to achieve certain other goals you have. But of course, that just pushes the problem back, right? You can always just ask about whatever your fundamental values are. Well, why that system, right? Why ought you to have those values? But I'm not sure why a moral skeptic would need to give an answer to that, right? I think the moral skeptic will just say, well, ultimately you just have whatever values you do.
Suppose that I am the kind of person who doesn't care about being rational, and instead cares about being comfortable. I could still have reasons to believe that some proposition is true, and yet choose to disbelieve it anyway because it makes me uncomfortable. If I were that kind of person, I don't see why I would have any obligation to believe the proposition. I would be acting irrationally in this scenario, but Queno hasn't done any work to show that I would be shirking some sort of stance-independent obligation to be rational. His bare assertion that I would be doing this amounts to patently begging the question. It will be unnecessary to pursue Queno's further objections to epistemic expressivism, because they are largely parasitic upon his objections to epistemic nihilism, and as we have seen, his objections here are unsuccessful and plausibly question-begging. One final thought, though, is that a running theme throughout these chapters is that the rejection of epistemic facts entails a commitment to radical skepticism. But never once does Queno show that radical skepticism is false. He just assumes throughout that it is an undesirable conclusion. And while I can agree with Queno that radical skepticism is undesirable, being undesirable is not the same thing as being false. Remember, Queno is supposed to be supporting the truth of the premise that epistemic facts exist. Showing that a denial of this premise might have some unpleasant consequences does not even begin to show that this premise is true. The final argument for moral realism, which I shall consider, is from David Enoch, and it has been called the argument from deliberative indispensability. Enoch explains, I argue that irreducibly normative truths, though not explanatorily indispensable, are nevertheless deliberatively indispensable. They are, in other words, indispensable for the project of deliberating and deciding what to do, and that this kind of indispensability is just as respectable as the more familiar explanatory kind. Deliberative indispensability, I argue, justifies belief in normative facts, just like the explanatory indispensability of theoretical entities like electrons justifies belief in electrons. Enoch begins by asking us to consider how our belief in the existence of electrons might be justified. Why should we believe in, say, electrons? One common and plausible answer runs like this. There are many inferences to the best explanation, the conclusion of which entails the existence of electrons. As I understand inferences to the best explanation, they are really particular instances of indispensability arguments. Electrons are indispensable for our best explanations, so by inference to the best explanation, electrons exist. Now, Enoch readily grants that normative truths do not play an explanatory role in the way that electrons do in our best scientific theories. Nevertheless, he maintains that, just as electrons are indispensable, deliberation about normative truths is likewise indispensable. He argues for the indispensability of deliberation as follows. Deliberation seems a rational, non-optional project for us. Perhaps this is so, partly because we are essentially deliberative creatures. Perhaps, in other words, we cannot avoid asking ourselves what to do, what to believe, how to reason, what to care about. The deliberative project is, then, intrinsically indispensable. If it is intrinsically indispensable for the deliberative project that P, we are justified in believing that P. At least, we are every bit as justified in so believing as we are in believing the conclusions of inferences to the best explanation. Enoch goes on to argue that normative reasons are indispensable for deliberation. He begins by asking us to reflect on what we are actually doing when we deliberate. All things considered, you ask yourself, what makes the best sense for me to do? When all is said and done, what should I do? What shall I do? When engaging in this deliberation, when asking yourself these questions, you assume, so it seems to me, that they have answers. You try to find out what the better answers to these questions are and how they interact so as to answer the arch question, the one about what it makes the most sense for you to do. When trying to make up your mind, it doesn't feel like just trying to make an arbitrary choice. This is just not what it is like to deliberate. Rather, it feels like trying to make the right choice. And from this, he draws the conclusion that the phenomenology of deliberation entails an indispensable commitment to normative facts. He writes, now that something is a normative reason for you to pursue some course of action, a consideration that counts in favor of so doing is a paradigmatically normative claim. So by deliberating, you commit yourself to there being relevant reasons, and so to there being relevant normative truths. Normative truths are thus indispensable for deliberation. So to put all that into a formal syllogism, Enoch formulates the argument from deliberative indispensability as follows. 1. If something is instrumentally indispensable to an intrinsically indispensable project, then we are epistemically justified, for that very reason, in believing that that thing exists. 2. The deliberative process is intrinsically indispensable. 3. Irreducibly normative truths are instrumentally indispensable to the deliberative project. 4. Therefore, we are epistemically justified in believing that there are irreducibly normative truths. Now, just on its face, we can see that this isn't really an argument for moral realism. This is an argument for normative realism. But since normative facts and moral facts are closely linked, and because I am inclined to reject the existence of stance-independent normative facts as well, I will take on Enoch's argument. I reject both the first and the third premises. I will begin by explaining my reasons for rejecting the third premise, as these will be briefer, and Enoch has much less to say in response to them. When I am deliberating about some course of action, I am not attempting to determine what I ought to do in the sense of determining what a stance-independent obligation compels me to do, nor am I trying to determine what is best or right in the sense of fulfilling some duty which exists independently of my own goals and desires. On the contrary, I am trying to determine which course of action will most successfully achieve my own goals and desires. Enoch is right that, when I deliberate, I am trying to get to some fact of the matter, but that fact is the state of affairs where I have the most of my goals fulfilled and the least undesirable consequences given the situation in which I am deliberating. Enoch anticipates this move, but his response is most brief and unsatisfactory. He responds by saying, "When you allow yourself to settle a deliberation by reference to a desire, you commit yourself to the judgment that your desire made the relevant action the one it makes the most sense to perform. This may be either because, say, there is a general reason to satisfy your desires, or because you take having a reason to simply consist in having the relevant desire. But on either of these options, and even with desires in hand, you still commit yourself to a normative truth." The question here is why. Why does settling a deliberation by recourse to a desire commit one to a normative truth in the stance-independent realist sense? If I have a desire which will be fulfilled by some course of action, I do not think that I am presupposing some further reason to satisfy my desires. The course of action can just satisfy or help to satisfy the desire with no need for further reasons. Desires thus can be groundless in this deliberative sense. I see no need for a further reason why some action satisfies my desire. The action does so, and that's the end of the story. This account is perfectly logically coherent, and I think it squares with my own experience of deliberation. Frustratingly, Enoch just doesn't defend his claim that the satisfaction of a desire presupposes a further reason to satisfy the desire. Instead, he merely asserts that this is the case and references Thomas Nagel's discussion of the topic. When one chases down his reference, they will find Nagel saying, "It is only when, instead of being pushed along by impressions, memories, impulses, desires, or whatever, one stops to ask, 'What should I do?' or 'What should I believe?' that reasoning becomes possible." While Nagel expresses deliberation in normative terms by using the word should, I have already explained how the same question can be represented without utilizing any normative terminology. Instead of saying, "What should I do?" one can ask, "What course of action achieves the state of affairs wherein the greatest number of my desires are fulfilled while incurring the least number of undesirable consequences?" While this latter way of putting the question is more cumbersome, it is perfectly intelligible, appeals to purely descriptive facts, and avoids normative language. Why, then, should one think that deliberating along these lines commits them to the existence of normative facts? Neither Enoch nor Nagel have given us an answer. Consequently, we may simply reject the third premise of the argument. But what about the first premise? Why would one think that indispensability confers epistemic justification? Enoch makes a great many appeals to abductive reasoning here, as likewise being indispensable. And his conclusion is that if one accepts abductive reasoning because it is indispensable, then they should accept the idea that indispensability yields justification. He writes, "Given some other purportedly respectable kind of indispensability, the proponent of inference to the best explanation must find some non-arbitrary way of distinguishing between explanatory and that other kind of indispensability. She must show, in other words, why it is that explanatory indispensability ought to be taken seriously, but other kinds of indispensability ought not be so taken. So think of my point here as a challenge. Can you think of any reason for grounding ontological commitment in explanatory indispensability that is not really more general? A reason for grounding ontological commitment in indispensabilities of other kinds as well. While one might question Enoch's judgment that abductive reasoning really does constitute any necessary appeal to indispensability, more fundamentally, we can question the idea that abduction yields justification because of its indispensability. That is, just because abduction may essentially make use of indispensability, it does not follow that this indispensability is what makes abduction capable of conferring justification. If abduction can generate justification for reasons other than an appeal to indispensability, then Enoch's parallel between abduction and indispensability simplicator will be broken such that to allow for abductive inferences to confer justification is not inconsistent. Before we turn to answer Enoch's challenge, we should note one preliminary. It is quite ironic that Enoch himself seems to favor the idea that abduction is not epistemically justified at all. He ends up appealing to pragmatic justifications for abductive reasoning. He writes, "Non-inferential belief-forming methods and other basic belief-forming methods are where epistemic justification comes to an end. If we are ever justified in any of our beliefs, then there must be basic belief-forming methods we are epistemically justified in employing, even though we do not, and perhaps cannot, possess an epistemic justification for so employing them." Arguably, inference to the best explanation is just such a rule. We infer to the best explanation, not because doing so is licensed by some other more basic belief-forming method, but rather basically. But if Enoch were to be right about abductive reasoning ultimately being unjustified in an epistemic sense, this would actually not support the first premise of his argument. If abductive reasoning cannot be justified, then the appropriate conclusion would be an abandonment of abduction. If an epistemic principle cannot confer epistemic justification, the proper solution is not to be even more permissive with one's epistemic principles. The proper solution is to jettison the unjustified principle. Regardless, there is no reason to think that the skeptic of Enoch's argument must abandon abductive reasoning. Best explanations are assessed by recourse to various theoretical virtues, such as simplicity, explanatory power, explanatory scope, and so on. My own view is that theoretical virtues can, upon reflection, be certified a priori to increase the probable truth of a hypothesis which satisfies more of them. It is in virtue of an explanation satisfying these criteria better than any alternative which yields a justified inference to that explanation. There is nothing comparable to these criteria in mere indispensability. Thus, even if Enoch were to be right that normative truths were indispensable to deliberation, we could still reject his first premise that something's being indispensable makes belief in it justified. Moreover, we may do so without embracing any sort of skepticism about inference to the best explanation. Hopefully this brief survey of some of the more popular arguments for moral realism has gone some way towards justifying my first concern about moral arguments for theism, namely that there just isn't very good evidence for moral realism in the first place. Thus, even if proponents of moral arguments for theism were correct that moral realism either entails or is best explained by theism, the atheist wouldn't have a very hard time simply denying moral realism and thereby avoiding the inference to theism. As Michael Martin says, in any case, let us assume, as Christian theists allege, that only a metaethics that presupposes God provides a firm, objective basis for our deepest moral convictions. Notice that this would not be an argument for the truth of belief in God, for atheists could simply say that, unfortunately, our deepest moral convictions have no objective basis. Regrettably, the implications of the truth are sometimes hard to accept. But I certainly do not want to give off the impression that the lack of evidence for moral realism is the only problem facing moral arguments. There are several other hurdles which the defender of the moral argument must overcome in order to successfully make their case. Therefore, I will assume moral realism for the remainder of this video for the sake of demonstrating that, even if moral realism were to be successfully demonstrated, it would still provide no evidence for theism. As I see it, there are 4 distinct challenges for moral arguments to overcome. Some versions do better than others in surmounting some of them, but as I shall attempt to show later on, no version successfully overcomes all 4 of them. The first of these challenges concerns the basic assumption inherent within all moral arguments, namely that moral truths need to be explained in the first place. This is actually quite a significant assumption, since moral truths, if they exist, could plausibly be construed as necessarily existing brute facts. Such truths would have the same sort of metaphysical status as God. They would exist without further explanation beyond their own necessity. Wes Morriston takes just such a position, claiming, "Why are love and justice and generosity and kindness and faithfulness good? What is there in the depths of reality to make them good?" My own preferred answer is, nothing further. If you like, you may say that they are the ultimate standard of goodness. What makes them the standard? Nothing further. Possessing these characteristics just is good making, full stop. Is there some problem with this? Some reason to press on, looking for a deeper answer that only theism can provide? It's not obvious that there is. No matter what story you tell about the ontological ground for moral value, you must at some point come to your own full stop. There is no contradiction in this proposal as far as I can see, but if this is right, then asking for an explanation for morality is as misguided as asking what caused God to exist. At the very least, one might expect proponents of the moral argument to offer some reason for thinking that moral truths require an explanation. Yet this is almost always just taken for granted from the start, as we shall see. The next challenge for proponents of moral arguments is to explain precisely how it is that God explains the existence of morality. Proponents of the moral argument typically just assume that God would be a good explanation for morality, but this assumption deserves to be questioned. Proponents of the moral argument will often try to ground morality in God's commands, but this runs directly into the Euthyphro dilemma. Does God command things because they are good, or is good merely a superfluous label which gets applied to whatever God commands? If the former, then it seems that morality has to be constituted by something other than God's commands. If the latter, then good becomes meaningless because God can command literally anything and it will be called good. Furthermore, this constitutes a retreat from moral realism, for God's commands are presumably reflective of and based upon God's own stances. But as we have seen, moral realism entails that moral facts and obligations be stance independent. So proponents of the moral argument must find a way for God to be explaining morality in such a way that preserves its stance independence. And while there have been many creative attempts to do this in the philosophical literature, it is seldom ever done on the popular level. As Jerry Walls and David Baggett correctly observe, if the moral argument for God's existence is to hold water, the Euthyphro dilemma and the handful of objections it raises against theistic ethics must be answered either by abandoning voluntarism altogether or by offering a more defensible version of divine command theory. A further challenge for moral arguments, at least when formulated deductively, concerns the existence of robust metaethical theories which make no reference to God. Again, most proponents of moral arguments don't even seem to be aware of such accounts. One of the most sophisticated of these is Eric Wielenberg's godless normative realism. As he explains, if there are activities available to us during our lifetimes that are intrinsically valuable, then our lives can have internal meaning even if God does not exist. Even if there is no supernatural commander to assign purposes to our lives or a suitably significant deity to care about our lives, the existence of intrinsically good activities would make it possible to bring internal meaning to our lives. I submit that there are such activities. On Wielenberg's view, there is a realm of Platonic abstract objects which supervene upon concrete states of affairs, such as love or murder, and in virtue of which those states of affairs are good or bad. For those unfamiliar with this idea, abstract objects are thought to be immaterial, multiply instantiable, necessary, eternal, and mind-independent entities which do not interact causally with the physical world. This idea, if one accepts it, has interesting implications for metaethics. As Walls and Baggett explain, Platonism would suggest that there are necessary moral truths, truths that obtain in all possible worlds, even worlds in which God does not exist. Wielenberg describes the supervenience relation of his theory as follows. An important feature of my view is that while many of the non-moral properties upon which moral properties desupervene can produce causal effects, the moral properties themselves are epiphenomenal. On my view, normative properties are neither identical with nor constituted by non-normative properties, but instantiations of the former are interwoven with instantiations of the latter. On this view, normative properties are sui generis, a fundamental type of property not reducible to or fully constituted by some other type of property. Wielenberg's moral theory, in at least one way, shares a commonality with theism. Just as God is the rock bottom of the explanatory chain of existence, for Wielenberg, these abstract entities are the rock bottom of the explanatory chain of morality. He says, "My version of non-theistic robust normative realism has an ontological commitment shared by many theists. It implies the obtaining of substantive, metaphysically necessary brute facts. Some ethical facts fall into this category. I call such facts basic ethical facts. Such facts are the foundation of the rest of objective morality and rest on no foundation themselves. To ask of such facts, where do they come from, or on what foundation do they rest, is misguided in much the same way that, according to many theists, it is misguided to ask of God, where does he come from, or on what foundation does he rest? The answer is the same in both cases. They come from nowhere, and nothing external to themselves grounds their existence. The existence of accounts such as Wielenberg's creates serious difficulties for very ambitious moral arguments, which attempt to show that moral realism is logically incompatible with atheism. For proponents of such ambitious moral arguments must demonstrate logical contradictions within all actual and potential non-theistic accounts of moral realism. That is a tall order, to say the least, and yet it is unfortunately commonplace to find popular apologists with no awareness at all of metaethical accounts like Wielenberg's, let alone any serious objections to such accounts, making absurdly strong claims such as, if God does not exist, then objective moral facts and duties do not exist. When pressed, most apologists really end up meaning that if God does not exist, then they cannot think of another way for objective moral facts and duties to exist. But if even one of these non-theistic accounts of moral realism is even possible, then such strong statements are false. Now, some defenders of the moral argument, especially on the popular level, will try to block an appeal to something like abstract objects because they erroneously think that atheism is committed to materialism and so cannot make use of immaterial abstract entities. But this confuses atheism with materialism. Properly understood, atheism is just the belief that no God or gods exist. It says nothing whatsoever about the existence of non-theistic immaterial entities. An atheist is not being inconsistent with himself by adopting something like Platonism. As J.L. Schellenberg explains, one can quite consistently be an atheist and an ultimist, one who believes in an ultimate source of things, value, and importance at the same time. This may seem surprising to some readers who have become used to thinking of atheists as denying all religious claims. It has to be conceded that what we might call popular atheism often does so, but this, I'm inclined to believe, is often due to unclear thinking, a tendency to blur concepts at their edges or run them together. For example, the concept of atheism and that of metaphysical naturalism, the idea that physical nature is all there is. The latter idea is perfectly irreligious, but the former is not. An atheist in the philosophical sense need not be a metaphysical naturalist. Following the last point concerning the existence of logically possible non-theistic accounts of moral realism, these accounts create a challenge even for those who make the more modest claim that God is merely the best explanation of moral facts and obligations. One must bring their theistic moral theory into competition with non-theistic moral theories and show that their theistic model possesses some sort of theoretical virtue or explanatory advantage. Unfortunately, even defenders of more modest moral arguments are frequently reluctant to engage in this sort of theory comparison with actual alternative theories to demonstrate how theism is the best explanation of morality. In this video, I will use Eric Wielenberg's theory as a test case and see how various versions of the moral argument fare against it in establishing God as the superior explanation of morality. Now, as I have already said, some moral arguments are able to overcome some of these hurdles better than others. My aim throughout this next section of this video will be to show that none of them overcomes all of the difficulties, and so moral arguments are not successful. There are more versions of the moral argument than I could ever hope to critique in this video. However, I have selected 4 different versions which I think capture the basic approaches which are open to theists. These are 1. Straightforward deductive arguments for God's existence from moral facts or obligations. 2. Straightforward abductive arguments for God's existence from moral facts or obligations. 3. Abductive arguments for God's existence from just moral obligations. And 4. Abductive arguments for God's existence from moral facts or obligations on the basis of something specific about God. Because of the great amount of literature written in defense of each of these species of arguments, I am once again forced to be selective in my choice of interlocutors. I have chosen William Lane Craig as an interlocutor for the first category, since he is probably the best known defender of a deductive moral argument for theism. I have chosen Jerry Walls and David Baggett as my interlocutors for the second category, since their trilogy of books on the moral argument represents a comprehensive and straightforward abductive moral argument. I have chosen C. Stephen Evans as my interlocutor for the third category, since his moral argument for theism is based solely upon moral obligations and not upon moral facts. And finally, I have selected Adam Johnson as my interlocutor in the fourth category, since his moral argument for theism is closely tied to Trinitarianism. For each of these versions of the moral argument, I will proceed to test them against the 4 challenges which I raised for moral arguments to see how well they fare against them. I have ordered them according to how well I think they succeed at overcoming these challenges, with Craig's argument failing all 4 of the challenges and Johnson's only clearly failing the last. Perhaps the best known contemporary defender of a moral argument, and indeed perhaps the best known Christian apologist of the modern day, is William Lane Craig. He offers a simple and straightforward deductive argument for God's existence based upon moral realism. Craig formulates his argument as follows. 1. If God does not exist, objective moral values and duties do not exist. 2. Objective moral values and duties do exist. 3. Therefore, God exists. I have already expressed my skepticism with respect to the second premise. Craig doesn't typically attempt a sophisticated defense of this premise beyond a claim, rather presumptuously, that everyone already knows it to be true.
But the problem is that objective values do exist, and deep down we all know it.
In any case, what reason is there for thinking there are objective moral values? There must be a good argument for this. After all, there are no objective aesthetic values, quite plausibly, so Dr. Craig must give us an argument for saying there are objective moral ones. What is the argument? Well, it was striking, so I wrote it down. He said, there are objective moral values because deep down we know there are. That's it. That's the argument. Now, that may pass for an argument in Talbot Theological College. It may indeed pass for an argument in the White House. But, but this is Cambridge, and it doesn't pass for an argument here.
Nevertheless, I will grant the second premise for the sake of argument. But what reason is there to think that the first premise is true? Viewers need to understand how strong of a claim Craig is really making. His first premise entails not just that objective morality would be significantly different or unlikely given atheism. No, his first premise entails that there is no possible way for objective morality to exist at all given atheism. In defense of this premise, Craig writes, if God does not exist, then what is the foundation for moral values? More particularly, what is the basis for the value of human beings? If God does not exist, then it is difficult to see any reason to think that human beings are special or that their morality is objectively valid. But this is no defense of the first premise. This is just a question being posed to the atheist. Even if the atheist has no answer whatsoever to this question, it could merely remain an unanswered question. This would provide no grounds at all for concluding that only theism could explain moral facts. Moreover, notice how Craig has merely presupposed that moral facts need a basis. He does not attempt to justify that assumption at all. He just assumes that God would be able to explain the existence of moral facts. But he makes no attempt to explain how God is supposed to do this. So Craig does not even touch my first and second challenges, nor does he justify the first premise of his argument. As Wielenberg points out, this response reveals an assumption that underlies much of Craig's criticism of non-theistic approaches to moral realism. Objective morality requires a foundation external to itself. However, there is simply no good reason to accept this assumption. Craig believes quite strongly that if God does not exist, then humans are just like animals. He says,
On the atheistic view, human beings are just accidental byproducts of nature, which have evolved relatively recently on an infinitesimal speck of dust called the planet Earth, lost somewhere in a hostile and mindless universe in which are doomed to perish individually and collectively in a relatively short time. On atheism, I can't see any reason to think that human well-being is objectively good, any more than insect well-being, or dog well-being, or monkey well-being. On a naturalistic view, moral values are just the byproduct of biological evolution and social conditioning.
Now, these are the only sorts of defenses which Craig gives of the first premise of his argument, and it's difficult to see how Craig is not merely begging the question with statements like this. He asserts that given atheism, nothing is really wrong, but that is the very point of contention. That is the premise of his argument which he needs to support. As James Fodor laments, uncharacteristically, Craig does not provide any clear or coherent argument in favor of his crucial premise that moral facts cannot be grounded outside of God. Raphael Laddister is even harsher, saying, Craig continues to doubt that objective morality could exist without God, failing to rule out the possibility, while also failing to demonstrate that objective morality would certainly exist with God. Craig will sometimes quote prominent atheists such as Richard Dawkins, Bertrand Russell, Michael Ruse, or Friedrich Nietzsche, who have thought that moral facts do not exist because they believe that God does not exist.
Richard Dawkins' assessment of human worth may be depressing, but why, on atheism, is he mistaken when he says, there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but pointless indifference. We are machines for propagating DNA. It is every living object's sole reason for being. Michael Ruse, a noted philosopher of science, explains, the position of the modern evolutionist is that morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, love thy neighbor as thyself, they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. As the Russian writer Fyodor Dostoevsky rightly said, if there is no immortality, then all things are permitted. Now, as I said, this is a conclusion which is accepted by a great many atheist philosophers, such as Nietzsche, Russell, and Sartre. Though the conclusion is a painful one, these thinkers believe that honesty compels them to face it squarely.
But Craig clearly has no problem disagreeing with these atheists on a great many other things, so why has he suddenly chosen to treat their opinions as so authoritative in this case? As Walter Sinnott Armstrong points out, why should we believe that objective moral values depend on God? Because Russell, Ruse, and Nietzsche say so? But their claims are denied by many philosophers, atheists as well as theists. Even Russell and Ruse themselves denied these claims at other times in their careers, so Craig needs a reason to believe some authorities rather than others. Elsewhere, Sinnott Armstrong says, theists often cite our old foe, if God is dead, everything is permitted. But why believe this? Just because Nietzsche or Ivan Karamazov said so? Theists think that Nietzsche and Ivan are wrong about almost everything else, so why agree with them on this point? Atheists do not have to agree with everything that other atheists say. But not only is the first premise of Craig's argument unjustified, it is almost certainly false. There are dozens of proposed non-theistic accounts of morality on offer, but Craig never does any of the heavy lifting to show that they are all impossible. If even one non-theistic account of moral realism is even possible, then the first premise of his argument is refuted. Craig takes a very dismissive attitude towards these non-theistic moral theories, saying, simply providing a list of alternative moral theories does nothing to show the theory's explanatory adequacy, that these are good theories or plausible theories. But that misses the point. The first premise of his argument does not say that God is the most plausible or most adequate explanation of moral values and duties. It says that God is the only possible explanation. This is a very strong claim, which requires that Craig do the legwork of showing that each and every actual and hypothetical non-theistic moral theory is logically impossible, I submit that Craig has not even begun to accomplish that task. As James Fodor says, if Craig wants to do what he describes as serious metaphysics, then he must engage with these theories and show why they cannot serve as a foundation for objective morality. Simply ignoring them demonstrates a lack of serious engagement with the literature, and thus critically undermines Craig's argument. Furthermore, it is not enough for Craig to argue that we don't have sufficient reason to believe that any particular such theory of morality is true, for this would be to make only an epistemological claim that he insists is irrelevant to his argument. Instead, he must demonstrate that none of these theories can provide a plausible foundation for objective moral facts. Since he makes no such effort to do so, I believe that Craig has given very little reason for accepting his crucial premise. To take Eric Wielenberg's moral Platonism as an example, there doesn't seem to be anything logically incoherent about saying that morality consists in a supervenience or making relation between abstract moral properties and particular states of affairs. In his interactions with Wielenberg, Craig complains about such things as having no evidence for abstract entities, or finding it ambiguous as to how supervenience is supposed to work, claiming, Platonism is a metaphysical view which is so extravagant that it makes theism, which itself involves substantial metaphysical commitments, look modest by comparison, and objecting that Wielenberg imputes to physical objects causal powers that are mysterious and completely unknown to contemporary physics. But none of these criticisms comes anywhere near to showing that Wielenberg's model is logically contradictory and thus impossible. As long as Wielenberg's model is even possible, the first premise of Craig's argument will be false. If it is possible for atheism to have objective moral values and duties, then it is false to claim that if God does not exist, then objective moral values and duties do not exist. And here we come to the real problem with Craig's first premise. There is only one way to make this first premise work, and that is to define morality in terms of God. If the first premise were modified to say, if God does not exist, then God-given moral values and duties do not exist, the premise would be necessarily true. But while such a move would render the first premise justified, it would do so at the cost of making the argument patently question-begging. As Raphael Laddister points out, I also think that a more evidentially justified form of the first premise would read, if God does not exist, God-given morality does not exist. This altered first premise seems rather obvious and insignificant, while also rendering the argument logically invalid. If the second premise were similarly altered as to make the argument logically valid once more, Craig's hope of procuring evidence to justify his second premise vanishes. Rather than needing to complete the already difficult task of providing the evidence for objective morality, Craig would need to prove the existence of God-given morality, when it is not even known that God exists. That God exists is the conclusion of the argument, after all. It will be quite the challenge for Craig to proceed without resorting to tautological or circular reasoning. It looks as though Craig's version of the moral argument will only succeed at the cost of becoming a circular argument, and that alone should provide the apologist with sufficient reason to avoid it. Craig's moral argument fails all four of the challenges which I have put forth for a moral argument. The second version of the moral argument, which we will explore, is an abductive version of the argument, as spearheaded by Jerry Walls and David Baggett in their trilogy of books on the topic. Their argument has a decided advantage over Craig's version because it is an inference to God as the best explanation of moral facts. As they claim, full moral theory does, we agree, require God at its foundation to be complete, and God's inclusion is most important of all. But the resources of this world, created by God, can meet with some measure of success the task of moral theory. That this is so, we contend, provides grounds for secular thinkers to be slow to accept Craig's first premise. We don't have to argue that a world like this without God entails no real morality at all in our effort to show that the moral argument is a powerful tool in our apologetic arsenal. The abductive approach does not rely on the deductive one. If anything, the argumentation needed to back up the premises in the deductive version relies on a lot of patient background abductive work. So unlike Craig's deductive argument, they don't have to show that all non-theistic versions of moral realism are logically impossible. Instead, they can simply show that theism has certain explanatory advantages over these non-theistic accounts of morality. While this makes their argument more modest than Craig's, it also makes it much more defensible. As they explain, we are not just defending the mere possibility of a theistic ethic, but its rational plausibility and the effectiveness of theism to provide better explanations of moral facts than its alternatives. This exempts their argument from my third challenge, since abductive arguments, by their very nature, presuppose the existence of other possible explanations. Their book, Good God, The Theistic Foundations of Morality, is largely an attempt to spell out the relationship between God and morality in such a way so as to avoid the aforementioned Euthyphro dilemma. Their solution is to view this relationship as one of identity. That is to say, they view God as explaining goodness by being identical to it. They explain, when it comes to the ultimate good, we are inclined to say more than that it depends on God. In some important sense, we wish to argue that God just is the ultimate good. For the goodness for the sake of which and in accordance with which God wills whatever he wills regarding human morality is identical with his nature. Yet since it is God's very nature, and no arbitrary decision of his, that thus constitutes the standard of morality, only things consonant with God's nature could be morally good. And they go on to explain how this enables them to avoid both horns of the Euthyphro dilemma, saying, on our view, it's God's commands that best enable us to determine which actions among those that are good are also morally obligatory. God's commands determine what's morally obligatory, but not what's morally good. So our view will embrace a non-voluntarist account of the good and a voluntarist account of the right. Moral goodness is not independent of God, despite the fact that it's independent of God's commands. This move enables them to get around the second challenge which I have raised for moral arguments. They have a ready account of how it is that God explains morality, and they do so in such a way that avoids the Euthyphro dilemma. By making only moral obligations depend upon God's commands, they escape the charge of abandoning moral realism, while their understanding God's commands to track necessary moral facts contained in his own being enables them to avoid any arbitrariness in God's commands. In a sense, they may also have a way around the first challenge. Since they are just equating morality with goodness, there is an important sense in which their account leaves the existence of morality unexplained, since God himself has no further explanation for his existence. This moves the dialectic from considering what might be the best explanation for the existence of moral facts to considering what is the best explanation for the identity of moral facts. There may, however, be a parallel challenge for Walls and Baggett here, namely, why is it that we should seek a further identity for moral properties? So far as I know, they do not answer this parallel challenge. Walls and Baggett do engage in theory comparison with Eric Wielenberg's moral theory in their book God and Cosmos, and thereby take up my fourth challenge for moral arguments. Their primary objection, which they level against Wielenberg's theory, is somewhat difficult to interpret. They argue, it is quintessential question-begging to assume that this supervenient story is consistent with secularism, because if humans are created by God in his image, then being human would have for one of its essential features a relational property of which God is a part. How can the existence of persons be accounted for on Wielenberg's view? In a world as he envisions it, the emergence of persons is far from an obvious eventuality. Wielenberg wants to say, understandably, that humans are ever so much more, feelers and thinkers and reasoners and lovers, but to simply assume we can be all those things on a secular view of the world and the human condition, despite the vast qualitative leaps involved and what rugged honesty about the implications of such things as causal closure of the physical suggest, seems misguided and question-begging. The main point is clear enough, namely that given Wielenberg's atheism, they doubt that he has the resources to explain the specific properties which humans bear. As they conclude, it's not at all clear that Wielenberg is within his epistemic rights to be sanguine in his affirmation of a human nature or essence on his worldview. What's not clear is how they think that he is or at least might be begging the question. Their comments about the image of God suggest that they take this to be an essential property of the human constitution. Fair enough, but are we really to believe that if that element of the human nature were stripped away, then nothing more would remain? Surely Walls and Baggett do not want to maintain that being in the image of God is the only possible concept of being human, and if they do, then it seems clear that it is they, rather than Wielenberg, who are begging the question as to what it means to be human. They go on at some length, citing atheists like Daniel Dennett and Owen Flanagan, who have argued against the very existence of the things to which one might appeal to ground human nature, such as consciousness or free will. Apparently, the upshot of this discussion is supposed to be that this provides some reason for thinking that human beings cannot be more than a pack of neurons given atheism. But it's not really clear why the opinions of these other atheists should affect Wielenberg, or at least someone who adopts his theory as an explanation for moral facts. Indeed, Walls and Baggett don't seem to be arguing that theism provides a superior explanation for moral facts here at all. This looks like a wholly different argument for theism based upon the existence of human persons or consciousness or something like that. And I'm happy enough to grant that things like consciousness provide evidence for theism, but I am here interested in whether or not moral facts provide evidence for theism. All this talk about the nature of human beings seems to me tangential to the topic at hand. Being a Platonist, it seems that Wielenberg could ground human nature in some sort of abstract form of humanness, and if things like mind-body physicalism or causal closure are going to be a problem for preserving human nature, the proponent of Wielenberg's theory can simply give them up, at least for the sake of argument. As already noted, atheism is merely committed to a denial of God's existence. It makes no claims about the nature of the human constitution. Atheism is not synonymous with mind-body physicalism or the causal closure of the physical. The pertinent question is, why think that theism better explains moral facts than Platonism? Walls and Baggett maintain that theism is a less ad hoc explanation for moral facts, saying, just because both theories posit facts does not make their claims equally legitimate. If you were to claim your pen's existence is a brute fact, for example, the assertion would altogether lack merit. A theist has principled reasons to think that God's existence is necessary, and that God functions as the very ground of being. What puts an end to the search for more adequate moral foundations is that there is, in actuality on this view, a real beginning and foundation to all else, a real locus of value, a primordial good of unsurpassable value. The brute facts posited by Wielenberg, in contrast, seem an ad hoc stopping point, simply invoking, in our estimation, some of the crucial moral facts in need of explanation. But this amounts to little more than an appeal to intuition that God is a better explanation for morality than Platonism. In virtue of what is Platonism more ad hoc than theism? As best I can understand Walls and Baggett, this is in virtue of it not positing a more basic foundation for everything else. But that is just to say that moral Platonism is not theism. Clearly it won't do to point out the trivial fact that one rival hypothesis is not the same as the other. The defender of Wielenberg's model is left without any solid reason for thinking that theism is objectively the better explanation. We have been told that theism is less ad hoc, but we have been denied an explanation for how this is so. But perhaps Platonism itself is best explained by theism. Walls and Baggett seem to think so, saying, following Tom Morris, we call the solution theistic activism. The whole Platonic realm is thus seen as deriving from God. The trick in effecting this rapprochement between realism and classical theism is to affirm the necessary existence and invariable nature of the Platonic realm while denying its aseity or absolute independence, an attribute of God alone. Were it to turn out that abstract objects themselves were dependent upon God, then they certainly would not afford the atheist an alternative explanation to theism for the existence of moral facts. However, so-called theistic activism or absolute creationism is not a very promising account of abstract objects. It is notoriously plagued by the bootstrapping problem. As Craig explains, according to absolute creationism, God has created all properties. In order to create properties, God would already have to possess certain properties. For example, in order to create the property being powerful, God would already have to be powerful. An impotent God obviously could not create anything. Thus, God would have to already possess a property in order to create it, which is viciously circular. Now, Walls and Baggett might try to maintain that God does not explain his own properties, but only all other properties. However, that will force them into a dilemma. On one side, they could say that God possesses uncreated properties. This will entail that at least those properties exist in a Platonic sense. Not only does this entail a denial of divine aseity, but it also raises the question as to why God is needed to explain some properties if he is not explaining all of them. On the other side, they could maintain that God is as he is without exemplifying any properties, but this will undercut any reasons that one might have for believing in abstract objects in the first place, inasmuch as it concedes that things can be as they are without any properties, and thus renders Platonism superfluous. Again, Craig says, with their backs apparently to the wall, some absolute creationists have conceded that God does not create his own properties, but they insist that God has created all other properties. This recourse, however, will either sacrifice divine aseity on the altar of Platonism, or else seems to yield the palm of victory to the anti-Platonist. Furthermore, to the extent that abstract objects remain abstract, it is difficult to see how theism can be the best explanation of such objects. Theism merely adds another entity to our ontology, and therefore creates additional complexity, which lowers the intrinsic probability of the hypothesis. As Brian Leftow argues, if we move abstract objects into God's mind as complexes of divine concepts, these too seem as abstract as ever. So if I am committed to abstract objects in the divine mind, arguably I must forfeit any claim that my theist theory is economical. It then does not eliminate ontology, but merely relocates it. Non-theist modal Platonists might then find a theist theory ill-motivated. They might see it this way: we have abstract objects in our ontology anyway. On a theist theory, we have these plus another entity, God. So parsimony rules in favor of non-theist Platonism unless one is antecedently committed to theism. I therefore conclude that Walls and Baggett have failed to establish theism as being the best explanation of morality. Their version of divine command theory, while ingeniously crafted to escape the Euthyphro dilemma, does not motivate the idea that morality needs greater identification and has no explanatory advantages over Platonism. I think that their argument is largely successful in overcoming the second and third of my challenges for moral arguments. It is at least unclear that it completely avoids the first challenge, and I think it positively fails the fourth challenge. C. Stephen Evans offers a somewhat unique abductive moral argument for theism in his book, God and Moral Obligation. Evans thinks that it is wrong to argue that moral facts give evidence for theism. However, he maintains that moral obligations do constitute evidence for theism. He writes, "It is not quite right to say that there would be nothing left of morality if God did not exist. However, leaving God out of the picture when it comes to morality puts pressure on us to revise our understanding of morality, or even lose faith in morality altogether. In particular, the part of morality termed obligation threatens to drop out of the picture or be transformed beyond recognition." Evans' approach appears to have a promising response to the first challenge which I raised. Because he only takes moral obligations to require an explanation, he can accept that moral truths exist necessarily. While he doesn't explicitly make this argument in his book, his own preferred account of moral obligations sees obligations as arising within a social context. And since such contexts do not exist necessarily, moral obligations will be contingent on this model. This will give us some reason to suppose that they may need an explanation, which will answer my first challenge. By arguing exclusively from moral obligation, Evans also enables himself to get around part of the second challenge which I initially raised for moral arguments, because this move helps him to escape the Euthyphro dilemma. He can claim that God's commands are not capricious or arbitrary because they track moral facts which do not depend upon God's subjective will. As he explains, restricting the account to moral obligations allows the defender of divine command theory to escape the dilemma. Are moral obligations duties because God commands them? The proponent of divine command theory answers yes. However, this does not imply that God's commands are arbitrary. God's commands are aimed at the good, and therefore certainly are not arbitrary. Since Evans' argument is abductive, the third challenge is also not as much of a problem for him as it is for someone like Craig. Still, Evans will need to show that his divine command theory of moral obligations is superior to the alternatives, and to his credit, he attempts to do just that both by spelling out some advantages of his own theory in Chapter 2, and then by raising some challenges for Wielenberg's account in Chapter 5. This brings us nicely along to my fourth challenge, for it is on this front that I think that Evans' argument flounders. Why is theism a better explanation for moral obligations than the non-theistic alternatives? I will again use Eric Wielenberg's non-theistic account as an alternative against which to compare Evans' theistic account to see if Evans' account has any explanatory advantage. Happily, Evans invites this comparison himself since he directly interacts with Wielenberg in the 5th chapter of his book. He begins by asserting that a Platonic theory of morality is not actually in competition with his own, since one could adopt the Platonic theory for moral facts, and even for some moral obligations, but one could conjoin this with his divine command theory of moral obligations, such that moral Platonism does not exhaust all there is to say about moral obligations. He explains, "It is not a rival view that must be refuted. First of all, as I have repeatedly stressed, a divine command theory presupposes a framework of moral truths as part of its foundation. For example, it presupposes that humans ought to obey any commands a good God might give. There is no reason for the defender of divine command theory to deny that some or all of these moral truths might be necessary truths." So far, so good. Evans is certainly right that a Platonic theory of moral facts need not conflict with a divine command theory of moral obligation, since one could think that God's commands just map onto those Platonic moral facts. Evans is even willing to acknowledge that some moral obligations could themselves be necessary truths, such as the obligation to obey God. But the worry arises that on such an account, it begins to look like God is unnecessary. After all, if some moral obligations can be necessary, then why can't all of them be necessary? And if all are necessary, what need remains for God to explain them? Evans anticipates this objection, but he counters it by insisting that there is a distinction between a fact being necessary and a fact being brute and thus unexplained. He writes, "One might think that there is a conflict between ethical non-naturalism and a divine command theory, because the necessary status of ethical truths implies that they need no such explanation. The person who makes such an objection to divine command theory might see moral facts as simply brute. Eric Wielenberg appears to hold such a view, giving arguments that it is just a brute fact of the universe that some actions are morally right and others are morally wrong. Certainly it seems to be the case that some necessary truths can be explained by other necessary truths. Take, for example, the proposition that it is false that every prime number is odd. This proposition is necessarily true, but its truth is to be explained by the truth of 2 is both even and prime. So the fact that a proposition is necessarily true does not, by itself, imply that it cannot be explained or does not require explanation." Evans is quite right that necessary truths can, in some instances, be explained by recourse to other necessary truths. But this misses the larger point. The concern is not that moral truths can be necessary, and therefore they cannot be explained. The concern is that if moral truths can be necessary, we need a reason for positing a further explanation for them, since at least some necessary truths are the stopping point of an explanation. In the case of his own example, a further explanation is needed for the necessary truth because this necessary truth is about other necessary truths. But moral truths do not, in general, seem to be about other necessary truths. Once we have stipulated that moral truths are necessary truths, what reason is there to want a further explanation? Evans' answer to this question is that moral obligations are surprising, and this apparently means that they need to be explained. He writes, "Let us assume that humans have moral obligations and that some of their obligations extend towards all other humans, including people that they do not even know and who cannot benefit or harm them. This fact, even if it is true, and even if it is necessarily true, seems surprising. If it is true, then it seems to be the kind of truth that cries out for an explanation." So the basis of Evans insisting upon a further explanation for necessary moral obligations ends up being his intuition that they are surprising and that they seem to cry out for an explanation. One can only imagine how Evans would respond if an atheist insisted that there had to be a further explanation for God's existence because God was surprising and his existence cried out for an explanation. The truth is that sometimes reality is surprising, and we just have to live with that, as even Adam Johnson admits. The fact is that reality is often peculiar. Therefore, Wielenberg's proposal can't be dismissed because many find it odd. A fact being surprising is no reason to suppose that it requires an explanation. Nor is it clear what it means for a fact to cry out for an explanation beyond one having the intuition that a fact needs to be explained. But as I argued earlier, intuitions do not confer justification, so Evans has left us wholly without any non-subjective reason for thinking that necessary moral obligations need to be explained at all, let alone that God is the best explanation of them. It is possible that Evans takes himself to have already argued for moral obligations needing an explanation, for in the second chapter of his book, he reflects upon the nature of obligations and contends that the very nature of obligations suggests that they have personal explanations. He writes, "On a social theory of obligation, these distinctive kinds of claims that persons can make on other persons are all the result of the particular social institutions and relations in which persons participate. Being a parent, for example, is a social role, which is partly constituted by the obligations one takes on by becoming a parent. Hence it is not accidental, but essential, that children have the right to certain things from their parents, and that parents have obligations to provide those things. If God exists and is a genuine person, then the relation between creature and creator is a genuine social relation, and like other such relations, carries with it distinctive obligations. The primary reason for thinking this is the case is simply that viewing moral obligations as divine commands makes more sense of these obligations than any alternative account." So Evans' primary argument for thinking that theism provides the best explanation for moral obligations is an argument based upon an analogy between social obligations and moral obligations. Since social obligations, such as obligations to and from parents with respect to their children, require a social context, so too do moral obligations require an analogous social context which can be met by positing a social relationship between humans and God. Now, on the one hand, one might theorize that moral obligations only begin to exist when human societies begin to exist. This would meet the social context requirement for obligation, but of course at the cost of admitting that moral obligations do not exist necessarily. But more fundamentally, if one could show that moral obligations are relevantly disanalogous to social obligations, then there will be reason to think that moral obligations are not to be explained in the same way as social obligations. Unfortunately for Evans, it is fairly easy to find disanalogies between these two types of obligations. Most strikingly, moral obligations are thought to be categorical. They are thought to hold independently of any conditionals. Even Evans admits as much in Chapter 1, saying, "In modern philosophy, terms like should and ought have a special moral sense, in which they imply some absolute verdict." But social obligations are not categorical in this way. To take the parent and child example, while children have a social obligation to obey their parents, this obligation is not categorical. There are instances, such as when a parent tells their child to lie to the police, that the child is free to flout that social obligation. Because of this critical difference between moral obligations and social obligations, Evans' analogy is broken, and it becomes doubtful that moral obligations are to be explained in the same way as social obligations. As Michael Huemer argues, someone telling you to do something does not, in general, create a moral obligation to do it. If your next-door neighbor tells you to kill your son, this creates no obligation at all, even prima facie, for you to do so. If Satan tells you to avoid eating pork, this creates no obligation to obey. There must be something special about God if his commands are to create moral obligations. What is it? I argue that the divine command theorist has no satisfactory answer to this question. The other worry here is that social obligations are not stance independent. These obligations and expectations are determined by the stances of human societies towards, say, the relationships of parents and children. So the more analogous Evans tries to make moral obligations to social obligations, the harder of a time he is going to have preserving the moral realist commitments of his theory. There is a fundamental dilemma for Evans' argument here. Either he can try to make moral obligations the same as social obligations, or he can try to make them different. If he makes them the same as social obligations, his theory is no longer a moral realist theory. If God's commands are no different than those of a parent or of a government, then they are not stance independent. However, if Evans makes moral obligations different from social obligations, then he loses his argument from analogy that God is the best explanation of moral obligations. Either horn of this dilemma proves fatal to Evans' argument. Consequently, while I think that Evans successfully overcomes the third of my challenges, it's unclear that he can escape the first, and he certainly can't escape the fourth. With respect to the second challenge, he is able to maintain moral realism with respect to moral facts. However, it is less clear that his theory of moral obligation remains compatible with moral realism. Adam Johnson has offered one of the most unique moral arguments in recent memory in his book, Divine Love Theory, and his argument is attractive because he makes the most sustained attempt which I have yet come across to explain the connection between God and morality. That is, Johnson actually tries to do the work of explaining how it is that God is supposed to explain the existence of moral facts. Furthermore, he extensively contrasts his theistic model of morality with Eric Wielenberg's non-theistic model, attempting to show that his theistic model is superior. Johnson follows the basic ethical theory set forward by Robert Adams in his book, Finite and Infinite Goods. Adams proposed that certain actions were moral in virtue of their resembling God, saying, God is the supreme good, and the goodness of other things consists in a sort of resemblance to God. In this way, God functions as the standard for morality, and so God is necessary for its very existence. But Johnson goes further than Adams. He specifies that certain actions are moral not merely in virtue of their resembling God, but rather in virtue of their resembling the eternal and perfect love which exists among the three persons of the Trinity. Johnson's moral theory is thus both inherently theistic and inherently Trinitarian. As he explains, I agree with Adams that the ultimate good is God, and that humans are morally good if they resemble God in a morally pertinent way. However, my divine love theory goes one step further by proposing that the specific thing being resembled in God's Trinitarian nature, as found in and expressed among the loving relationships between the persons of the Trinity. Therefore, I propose that God's inner Trinitarian relationships provide the ultimate foundation for objective morality, and that humans are good when they resemble the loving divine relationships in a morally pertinent sense. Now, immediately, I do have some concerns about this account. I can see how, for example, goodness is being explained by reference to a relation between some action and God's love, but I do have some difficulty in seeing how this account explains evil. On the one hand, one might be tempted to say that an action is immoral to the extent that it does not resemble the love of God. But remember that good and evil are not binary categories which exhaust all types of actions. Most ethicists also recognize a category for amoral or non-moral actions. For example, the act of eating a glazed donut. Presumably, Johnson does not think that eating a glazed donut resembles the love of the Trinity in a morally pertinent way. But presumably, also, Johnson does not want to claim that this action is therefore evil or immoral. So a question arises as to what makes an action immoral as opposed to merely non-moral. Merely not resembling God's love is insufficient to adjudicate between these categories. I don't think that this is a devastating objection to Johnson's model by any means. I suspect he could build something into it which would explain why certain actions are immoral, so I won't harp on this point. For the purposes of this video, I am content to say that his account overcomes my second challenge for moral arguments. Johnson follows Wall's, Baggett, and Evans by understanding moral obligations as being generated by God's commands. A pressing concern for those who wish to explain moral obligations by recourse to God is known as the problem of prior obligations. In short, the objection goes something like this. If God is the source of moral obligations, what is it that obligates people to obey those obligations? The question sets up a dilemma. If the proponent of divine command theory says that God also obligates us to obey his obligations, then there is a circularity problem. But if the obligation comes from somewhere else, then the divine command theorist has admitted that obligations can come from somewhere besides God, and therefore, God is not required for moral obligations at all. C. Stephen Evans summarizes the objection as follows. The prior obligations objection argues that there must be some moral obligations that are not grounded in divine commands because they hold antecedently to or independently of divine commands. Specifically, the claim is that humans have a moral obligation to obey God. This obligation is not itself grounded in God's commands. Rather, it is precisely because there is a prior obligation to obey God that God's commands can create new obligations. There must, therefore, be some obligations other than those that are created by God's commands. Now, I don't think that this is an insurmountable objection to theistic accounts of moral obligation, but I bring it up here because Johnson's answer to it creates difficulties for his arguments later on. Johnson approvingly cites John Hare's response to this objection. Hare grasps the second horn of the dilemma, arguing that the proposition that God ought to be obeyed is analytically true. He says, "It is necessarily true that God is to be loved. We know this just by knowing the terms God and to be loved. This is because we know that if God exists, God is supremely good, and we know that what is supremely good is to be loved. It is also true that we know that to love God is at least to obey God. Loving God is not simply to repeat God's will and our will, because there are things God wills that God does not will for us to will. So what we are to repeat in our wills is God's will for our willing. But willing what God wills for our willing is obedience. So it is necessarily true, not just that God is to be loved, but that God is to be obeyed. This means that divine commands do not generate all our obligations because there is one important exception, namely the obligation to obey divine commands." And Johnson himself concludes, "Our obligation to obey God's commands comes from the necessary truth that God should be loved. If God should be loved, and obeying God's commands is one of the primary ways we can love him, then we should obey his commands in order to love him. The fact God should be loved generates our moral obligation to obey God's commands." Hare and Johnson are clearly grasping the second horn of the dilemma, claiming that all moral obligations except for one come from God. It is, in my estimation, highly dubious, however, that the proposition that God ought to be obeyed is analytically true. A proposition is analytically true when it is true in virtue of what it means, or by definition. An example here is all bachelors are men. The proposition is analytically true because being a man is part of the definition of the word bachelor. The difficulty for Hare and for Johnson is that they conclude that if God is, by definition, to be loved, then God is, by definition, to be obeyed. This requires that the words love and obedience be exact synonyms, but it seems clear that they are not, for we can think of countless examples where love and obedience can come apart. Consider the proposition that a parent ought to love their child. Does it follow from this that a parent ought to obey their child? Certainly not. Consider the proposition that a husband ought to love his wife. Does this mean that a husband ought to always obey his wife? Again, surely not. So love and obedience are not synonymous, and therefore it does not follow from the proposition that God is to be loved that God must also be obeyed. It is not an analytic truth. But leaving aside for the moment that neither Hare nor Johnson gives us an explanation for how a truth, necessary or otherwise, is capable of generating obligations, and leaving aside the worry that the proposition that God ought to be obeyed is not in fact analytic at all, the salient point is that by grasping the second horn of the dilemma, Johnson is implicitly abandoning the idea that God is necessary for moral obligations. That is, he has committed himself to the proposition that necessarily true propositions are, at least in this one instance, capable of generating moral obligations without God having to issue such a command. This is, of course, a legitimate move for Johnson to make, but it creates serious problems for him later on, as we shall see. After laying out his moral theory, Johnson moves to compare it with Eric Wielenberg's godless normative realism, for the sake of seeing which theory provides a better explanation for morality. He contends that his explanation is superior to Wielenberg's in at least 4 ways. Specifically, he maintains that a moral theory requires an exemplar for moral value, a human telos or purpose for moral obligation, a social context for moral obligation, and a head at the chain of moral obligation. Moreover, he maintains that his moral theory fulfills each of these requirements, whereas Wielenberg's does not. It is important to note at the outset that only the first of these requirements pertains to moral facts. The other 3 pertain exclusively to moral obligation. This means that even if Johnson's account has an advantage on these latter 3 requirements, this will only support theism as a superior explanation of moral obligations and not of moral facts. In order for theism to also be a better explanation for moral facts, it is paramount that Johnson's first point holds. Again, this first point maintains that an exemplar is required for moral value. Why is that? Well, Johnson explains, the first element required for objective morality that my theory provides and Wielenberg's model does not is an ultimate standard for morality from which to judge whether other things are good. Without such a fixed absolute exemplar, there is no standard by which to measure whether something is good or bad. With a perfectly moral being as the exemplar, there's something by which we can measure the goodness of other things. Wielenberg's model has no such concrete exemplar. It's difficult to think how abstract brute ethical facts could serve as an exemplar when they have no moral value in and of themselves. While I am willing to grant that Johnson is correct that his theory contains a perfect exemplar for moral behavior and Wielenberg's does not, I am skeptical of his claim that such an exemplar is required for an adequate account of moral realism. What work is this exemplar supposed to be doing within the moral theory? As best I can tell, the exemplar is functioning in a strictly epistemological role. That is, the exemplar is supposed to be providing a reference guide by which to determine whether or not some action is moral or immoral. Now notice that this means that, as an exemplar, God is not serving to explain the existence of moral facts. He is merely serving to explain the existence of human knowledge of moral facts. But even if a moral exemplar were needed for moral knowledge, this does not make morality less objective on Wielenberg's view. Morality could still be objective even if there were no way to determine what is and is not moral. So contrary to Johnson's claim, an exemplar of moral value is not needed for morality to be objective. At best, such an exemplar is needed for moral knowledge. But I suppose that Johnson is free to argue that his account still enjoys an advantage over Wielenberg's because his theory has the resources to account for moral knowledge. However, this is not clearly true either, for the question may still be raised as to how one determines that their actions are resembling the exemplar of moral value. It seems that the theist is going to have to appeal to the same sorts of things which atheists appeal to, namely moral intuitions or properly functioning moral faculties or something of that nature. In other words, theists and atheists are roughly equally matched when it comes to moral epistemology. The theist, therefore, needs to argue that theism has an advantage when it comes to explaining the existence of moral facts, not moral knowledge. Johnson's point, as best I can tell, does not establish this. As we move to consider Johnson's other 3 points, remember that each of them is solely concerned with moral obligation, meaning that even if he is right that theism has an explanatory advantage in these areas, this will only yield the conclusion that theism better explains the existence of moral obligations, but this will not automatically mean that theism better explains the existence of moral facts. With that being said, Johnson's second contention is that his theory can explain the existence of purpose, which, in his view, is needed for moral obligations. He says, "My divine love theory, as opposed to Wielenberg's godless normative realism, contains a telos for human beings. As noted previously, I maintain that God's ultimate intention, or telos, for humans is that they join the communion of loving relationships among the persons of the Trinity." Once again, I am in agreement with Johnson that his theory includes the element of teleology due to his inclusion of an intentional agent, and Wielenberg's theory does not. However, I am unsure as to why he thinks that the element of teleology is required for moral obligations to be objective. Johnson approvingly cites many philosophers who agree with him upon the necessity of teleology for moral obligation. However, the only one who makes anything approaching an argument for this conclusion is Alasdair MacIntyre, who says, "Unless there is a telos which transcends the limited goods of practices by constituting the good of a whole human life, it will both be the case that a certain subversive arbitrariness will invade the moral life, and that we shall be unable to specify the context of certain virtues adequately." It seems that MacIntyre is making an argument from consequence, according to which, if teleology is removed from obligation, then moral actions seem arbitrary, and it will be impossible to determine the context of certain virtues. MacIntyre's latter point is epistemological in nature, and as such the objections which I raised against Johnson's earlier point apply to this one equally. In response to MacIntyre's first point, it is unclear why obligation should become any more arbitrary without a purpose. Johnson's own theory has stipulated that at least one obligation, the so-called prior obligation to obey God's commands, can be generated by a necessary truth. If it is not arbitrary, in virtue of the obligation being a necessary truth, then the defender of Wielenberg's theory can just say that all obligations are necessary truths. Either way, Johnson's theory has not surpassed Wielenberg's. But Johnson still protests. Intentionality is a key difference between my divine love theory and Wielenberg's godless normative realism. With the former, there is an intentionality at the root of reality that provides the should required for objective morality. Without it, the dreaded fact-value dichotomy raises its ugly head once again. How can you get a should from an is? Johnson is here just assuming, without argument, that intentionality can generate objective obligations. But why think that? His question for Wielenberg equally applies to himself. How can Johnson get an ought out of the is known as intentionality? And again, Johnson has already conceded that necessary truth is sufficient to generate moral obligations, at least when it comes to explaining the existence of the human obligation to obey God. But then on what non-arbitrary grounds can Johnson block the same move by Wielenberg? Why can't Wielenberg just say that moral facts are necessary truths, and because of this, they are capable of generating moral obligations? It's going to be very difficult for Johnson to maintain that we ought to obey God is the only obligation which can be generated from a necessary truth if he wants to avoid special pleading. Johnson's third requirement for a moral theory is a social context for moral obligation. He writes, "That God exists as a fellowship of three persons in loving relationships with each other provides a foundation for the relational context of moral obligation that Wielenberg's theory does not have." While he could similarly affirm that obligation arises from our relationships with other humans, compared with my divine love theory, his theory lacks a good explanation as to how and why this is the case. If Wielenberg is correct, then personal social relationships only arose accidentally through a contingent evolutionary process when humans evolved to such a level. My theory provides a better explanation for the relational context of reality that is so vital for the existence of moral obligation. An essentially personal and relational source of morality, God is Trinity, fits the personal aspect of our experience of morality better than Wielenberg's proposed impersonal Platonic source. While it is of course controversial that moral obligations do in fact depend upon a social context, and Johnson never argues for this thesis, I am willing enough to grant this for the sake of argument. Assuming that a social context is needed for obligations, it's very difficult to see what Johnson's argument is supposed to be. Surely he is not disputing that there can be societies in which moral obligations can exist on Wielenberg's model. So Wielenberg has no trouble accommodating a social context, and therefore he has no trouble explaining the existence of moral obligations. All that follows from the premise that obligations are social is that they require a society, not that they require a divine authority. As Mark Murphy points out, the key point here is that if the social character of obligation is understood in this holding responsible sense, there is nothing that mitigates in favor of obligatory norms originating in some authoritative party, whether an earthly sovereign in the case of legal obligation, or a divine sovereign in the case of moral obligation. What matters in either case is that there be some parties who have the standing to hold others responsible for their adherence to the relevant norms. But whether there are parties who are authorized to hold others responsible for adherence to the relevant norms is independent of whether the law-making source is in some sovereign like God, or in some set of customary rules, or in some set of norms that hold independently of anyone's willing or commanding. Johnson seems to think that he has an advantage in explaining why there is a society in the first place. If Wielenberg is right, the existence of human societies is just a cosmic accident in the greater scheme of things. Perhaps that is true, but why would that be relevant? Johnson is supposed to be arguing that theism better explains the existence of moral obligations in particular, not that theism better explains the existence of human societies, which also happen to be necessary for moral obligations. This would be like arguing that God is the best explanation for the existence of traffic circles, since traffic circles only make sense within a human society, and human societies couldn't exist without God. There is nothing about traffic circles in particular, as opposed to any other aspect of human society, which indicates theism, and the same applies to moral obligations. Both Johnson's moral theory and Wielenberg's moral theory include human societies. The fact that human society may be accidental according to Wielenberg's theory does not make it any less of a reality. As such, both theories have the resources to explain the social nature of moral obligations, and if Johnson wants to argue for theism on the basis of him having a better explanation for human societies existing at all, then he has simply left the domain of moral arguments. Johnson is making some other type of argument for theism at that point. As a final point, and again returning to the problem of prior obligations, it seems that Johnson cannot consistently maintain that a social context is required for moral obligations. Remember how he answered the question of what obligates us to obey God. He said that our obligation to obey God's commands comes from the necessary truth that God should be loved. True, this is an inherently social proposition, but importantly, for Johnson, it is the fact that the proposition is necessarily true which is generating the moral obligation, not the fact that it is an inherently social proposition. Now, a proposition could be necessarily true even if it were not social in nature, and the upshot of this is that if Johnson is really committing himself to the position that necessary truths are sufficient to generate moral obligations in order to evade the prior obligations objection to divine command theory, then he has abandoned the notion that moral obligations require a social context. Thus, Johnson faces a dilemma. Either he keeps his response to the prior obligation objection and admits that he doesn't have a social context advantage over Wielenberg, or else he keeps his social context advantage over Wielenberg, but once again has to stare down the prior obligations objection. In short, he either loses his presumed advantage over Wielenberg, or else he has to face a much more serious objection to his theory. The final advantage which Johnson claims for his theory over against Wielenberg's is that his includes an authority figure, God, to issue moral obligations and to whom people are accountable. He writes, "If there's no God, we could possibly understand how the evolutionary process would have developed in us a strong subjective impulse to help people, but it doesn't seem plausible to suppose that we could have an objective obligation to do so that stems objectively from outside us. Or shall we say, it's more clearly the case that we do have objective obligations in such a scenario if there exists a God to whom we are accountable. Without an authority on the top of the moral hierarchy, it's unclear how there could be an ultimate objective moral accountability." Unfortunately, and as with most defenders of moral arguments for theism, Johnson offers us no account of what it means to be authoritative or for God to have authority. He closely associates the term with the concept of accountability, but this begins to look dangerously like saying that God has the authority to tell us what to do just because he has the power to enforce his own rules. If authority cannot be distinguished from power, then it becomes unclear how divine obligations are in fact objective at all. Just saying that God is authoritative is no explanation. Johnson points out that it's not clear where a stance-independent moral obligation would come from given atheism, but it's also not clear where it would come from given theism. If obligations depend upon God's commands, then it seems like they are dependent on God's stances. But if they do, then they are not stance-independent. As such, the existence of stance-independent obligations becomes no less mysterious on Johnson's model than on Wielenberg's. Moreover, the inclusion of an authority in one's theory of moral obligations may be more of a theoretical vice than a virtue. Mark Murphy argues quite persuasively that the presumption is against any putative authority, such that any claims to authority require strong justification. He explains, there are strong reasons to think that, in the absence of good arguments for any of these authority theses, we should deny those theses rather than simply withhold belief with respect to them. We should do so because there is, in general, a reasonable presumption toward disbelief in authority relationships. If I were to claim that Will Clark is a practical authority over you, yet were to fail to offer you any evidence for this claim, you would not merely withhold belief on the question of Clark's practical authority over you, you would deny it. So in the vast run of cases, the presumption seems just right. The argumentative burden, thus, is on those who would reject it in the case of God's alleged authority over created rational beings. For unless one provides an argument for why the presumption applies to all other rational beings but not to God, one would be arbitrarily limiting the presumption's scope. If Murphy is right, and I think he is, then Johnson's inclusion of a personal authority in his meta-ethic not only fails to give him an advantage over Wielenberg, but actually puts him at a disadvantage. Johnson now has to justify the claim that God has authority over us before his meta-ethical theory will even be viable. And given that we're still trying to figure out whether or not he has even justified the proposition that God exists via a moral argument, it is very doubtful that he is going to be able to offer prior justification for the proposition that God exerts authority over us. In short, one has to justify the idea that God exists before they can justify the proposition that he holds any sort of authority over us. Finally, and as I have repeatedly pointed out throughout this video, Johnson's answer to the prior obligations objection creates problems for him here too, since he has already admitted that a necessary truth can generate the obligation that God ought to be obeyed without the need for a divine authority. Then Wielenberg is free to make the same move and say that moral obligations are merely generated by necessary truths. I don't see a way for Johnson to block this move without engaging in special pleading. Johnson spends a considerable amount of space objecting both to Wielenberg's moral epistemology and to his metaphysical account of godless normative realism. Johnson titles his first objection to Wielenberg's model, the Bloated Model Objection. Despite the singular title, this section of Johnson's book actually details 4 objections to Wielenberg's model. First, he objects that there is a lack of evidence for brute ethical facts. He writes, "It's difficult to argue against Wielenberg's assertion that these brute ethical facts exist because he provides no evidence or argument for them." But this isn't really an objection. Remember, Johnson is supposed to be engaging in theory comparison against Wielenberg to show that theism is the better explanation for morality. Wielenberg no more has to prove the existence of abstract objects before considering them than Johnson has to prove the existence of God. How well the hypothesis does at explaining the relevant data is the evidence for the hypothesis. That's just how abductive reasoning works. It would be a significant misstep for atheists to insist that theists provide evidence for God before being able to propose God as being the best explanation for the universe, or for fine-tuning, or for morality. It is just as much of a misstep for Johnson to expect independent evidence for abstract objects from Wielenberg. He writes, "We should ask, are there good reasons and evidence to believe that these brute ethical facts really exist? On the contrary, what we should ask is, which hypothesis, theism or Platonism, better explains moral facts? One doesn't have to justify the reality of an explanation before they propose it to explain a set of facts." Now, immediately after making this objection to Wielenberg's model, Johnson's argument takes a strange turn. He admits that one does not have to justify the existence of some entity before positing its existence to explain certain facts, saying, "To be consistent, theists who make moral arguments for God must at least admit that Wielenberg's abductive approach is viable." Quite so. Why then has Johnson raised this as one of his 4 objections to Wielenberg's model? The reason seems to be that Johnson takes it that there are other reasons to believe in God. He writes, "If all theists had was the moral argument, their overall case for God's existence would be fairly weak, but that's not the case. The moral argument for God is merely one among many arguments that theists have provided for God's existence. All else being equal, theists have much more evidence and arguments for God than Wielenberg has for his brute ethical facts." But presumably, being an atheist, Wielenberg doesn't accept those other arguments for theism either, so it's not clear what point there is in bringing them up. It's not as though there aren't plenty of arguments for the existence of abstract objects on offer in the literature. Moreover, Wielenberg may not think that God is a good explanation for morality in any case, so additional arguments for theism from other facts will be irrelevant when it comes to best explaining moral facts. But the salient point is that if the theist has to appeal to other arguments for theism in order to show that God is the best explanation for morality, this is a tacit admission that God is not the best explanation for morality if we are just comparing God to Wielenberg's model. It looks like the theist can't make the case for theism just based upon morality. He has to appeal to a bunch of other arguments to get there. If so, then it is those arguments, and not the moral argument, which is doing the real justificatory work. And if those other arguments are doing the primary justificatory work, this raises the question of why Johnson didn't write a book defending one of those arguments instead. On the whole, this is a quite puzzling section of the book. I do not know why Johnson thinks that this is an objection to Wielenberg. If anything, it looks like an admission that Wielenberg could explain the data better than Johnson if we were to restrict our considerations to just morality. Moving on to Johnson's second objection to Wielenberg's theory, he claims that brute ethical facts are an unsatisfying ultimate explanation for morality. He says, "It boils down to the following question: what is a more plausible ontological ultimate? God or brute ethical facts that are akin to Platonic abstract objects?" He then goes through several examples of theists and atheists claiming that they find brute ethical facts to be an unsatisfying explanation, and he mentions that some theists, such as Greg Welty, use abstract objects as an argument for theism, and he concludes by saying that Wielenberg is free to posit the existence of such brute ethical facts, of course, but it doesn't seem plausible to many theists and atheists that such facts could just exist on their own without any cause or explanation. Now, the way that Johnson has set up the question is already problematic. Things like plausibility and satisfaction are entirely subjective categories. The fact that some people find an explanation satisfying and others do not tells us absolutely nothing about whether it is the best explanation of some set of facts. It's important to remember that plausibility is not the same thing as probability. Probability consists in an objective relation which holds between evidence and a proposition. Plausibility is just a subjective feeling that one has toward some proposition based upon their prior beliefs. It is no wonder that Johnson, being a theist, finds theism more plausible than Platonism, but this does nothing to highlight any explanatory advantage in theism over Platonism. As for his claim that abstract objects might provide an argument for theism anyway, it is interesting that he cites Greg Welty's work here. While I intend to critique James Anderson and Greg Welty's argument for theism from logic in a future video in this series on apologetic arguments, which I avoid, for now, suffice to say that it is not an argument from abstract objects at all. Welty is a divine conceptualist, so he takes things like universals to be ideas in the mind of God. And while these perform the same work as abstract objects within his ontology, because these are actually mental entities, they end up being concrete rather than abstract. As Welty himself admits, "I operate with a purely functionalist account of abstract object. I can give my main argument without referencing the term abstract object. I am a realist about these objects, and a conceptualist, and a theist. So if divine ideas are concrete objects, then my position is that abstract objects, functionally speaking, are concrete objects ontologically speaking." So Welty has not made an argument from abstract objects at all. He has eliminated them from his worldview altogether and replaced them with God's ideas. And it's not all that significant that one can make an argument for God's existence from the premise that God's ideas exist. Furthermore, just because philosophers like Welty have thought that one can make a theistic argument from abstract objects, it doesn't follow that such arguments are ultimately any good. Precisely because divine conceptualism transmutes abstract objects into concrete objects, many philosophers doubt that God's thoughts are up to the challenge of playing the role of abstract objects at all. As William Lane Craig explains, the difficulty then for conceptualism is that God's thoughts as concrete objects are not universals but particulars, and so cannot be wholly present in spatially separated objects. We may, if we wish, take God's ideas or concepts to be the abstract content of God's thoughts, but God's thoughts cannot be abstract objects since they are mental states or events. Johnson's third objection to Wielenberg's model regards its commitment to a making relation wherein moral properties are instantiated by humans having appropriate cognitive faculties. Johnson offers two main objections here. First, he says that the capacities of cognitive faculties would be mere accidents given atheism, and second, he says that since human beings have different levels of cognitive faculties, this implies different levels of moral value and responsibility. I don't think that either of these is a serious objection to Wielenberg's view. Why is it a problem if the instantiation of moral properties by cognitive faculties is accidental? Intentional explanations are not inherently better than accidental explanations. As Wielenberg says, if, as I believe, there is no God, then it is in some sense an accident that we have the moral properties that we do. But that they are accidental in origin does not make these moral properties unreal or unimportant. Nor is it clear that having differing cognitive abilities implies a difference in moral value, since Wielenberg is free to posit that some very minimal threshold of cognitive ability grants full moral value to an individual. But even if Johnson were to be right about this point, that would just be a potentially unpleasant implication of Wielenberg's theory. It wouldn't tell us anything at all about how well Wielenberg's theory succeeds as an explanation for moral facts. At worst, we would be left with an unanswered question regarding how moral properties are instantiated. We are still left without any reason for preferring theism over Platonism. Johnson's final objection to Wielenberg's theory is that it leaves the connection between the natural world and the abstract world unexplained. He writes, "At least when it comes to understanding how moral properties can be connected to non-moral properties, the idea that the former supervenes on the latter is currently the most popular explanation. However, some have criticized the idea of supervenience by claiming it's not an explanation at all, but merely a filler word used to signify something for which we have no such explanation. Since natural properties are not agents, how do they know which moral properties to instantiate?" The question is bizarre, to say the least. On Wielenberg's view, the connection can simply obtain by necessity without any further explanation, and without anyone or anything needing to know which properties to instantiate. As Wielenberg explains, explanation, as they say, must come to an end somewhere. Why does being an instance of torturing someone just for fun entail moral wrongness? Because being an instance of torturing someone just for fun makes an act wrong. Eventually we hit bottom. No further explanation is available, but I don't see why possessing this sort of explanatory bottom is a problematic feature for a view to have. Indeed, Johnson's question verges on begging the question against Wielenberg in that it assumes that knowledge is necessary for moral properties to be instantiated. But why would anyone who is not already a theist assume that? And if the existence of unexplained relations is a problem for Wielenberg's theory, it seems that it is going to be a problem for Johnson's view too. After all, for Johnson, following Adams, morality consists in a resemblance relation between people and the love of the triune God. We might just as easily ask Johnson, since resemblance relations are not agents, how do they know when to obtain between agents and the love of the Trinity? Surely the answer cannot be that God himself, as a matter of sheer divine volition, creates resemblance relations. Presumably two apples don't resemble one another because God creates a resemblance relation between them. For otherwise, one seems forced to say that God could just as easily create the same sort of resemblance relation between an apple and an orange. But clearly that is wrong. Resemblance relations just obtain between similar objects by necessity, and that's the end of the story. So Johnson is committed to unexplained relations just as much as Wielenberg, meaning that Johnson's theistic hypothesis has no explanatory advantage over Wielenberg's hypothesis on this front either. Johnson sort of anticipates this objection as he goes on for the entirety of Chapter 9, attempting to explain the relationship between God's commands and God's nature as one of necessity. But this is different than the issue which I have raised. My concern regards not the relationship between God's commands and God's nature, but rather the resemblance relation between human actions and God's nature, in virtue of which those actions are supposed to be good. Johnson's model leaves this resemblance relation wholly unexplained, thereby making his model just as bloated as Wielenberg's in this way. Throughout all of the pages which Adam Johnson spends offering supposed advantages of his theory over Wielenberg's and supposed problems with Wielenberg's theory which his theory allegedly avoids, we have not seen an appeal to any of the criteria of a best explanation, at least not explicitly. Johnson does not attempt to show that his theory is simpler than Wielenberg's. He does not attempt to show that it has greater explanatory power or greater explanatory scope, or provides illumination into some other long-standing problem in philosophy. His method of argumentation has appealed to unjustified criteria, which are supposedly necessary for a theory of morality to be objective. He has referenced other arguments for theism, which are not germane to moral theory. He has appealed to subjective intuitions about Wielenberg's theory being unsatisfying and implausible, and he has objected to Wielenberg's dependence upon unexplained relations, even though his own theory likewise requires them. In over 160 pages of writing, we have not been given a solid reason to see theism as being more probable of an explanation for moral facts than Platonism. Johnson has one final objection to Wielenberg's theory, which is epistemological in nature. He calls it the lucky coincidence objection. He puts the objection in the following syllogistic form. 1. The probability of our cognitive faculties being reliable, given atheism and evolution, is low. 2. If someone believes atheism and evolution, and sees that the probability of our cognitive faculties being reliable, given atheism and evolution, is low, then they have a defeater for their belief that our cognitive faculties are reliable. 3. If someone has a defeater for the reliability of their cognitive faculties, then they have a defeater for any belief produced by their cognitive faculties. 4. Our moral beliefs are produced by our cognitive faculties. 5. Therefore, if someone believes atheism and evolution, then they have a defeater for their belief that their moral beliefs are reliable. Now, as I have indicated earlier in my discussion on moral realism, I don't think that anyone has a reason to believe that their moral beliefs are true. So in one sense, I would be happy to forego this portion of Johnson's argument, since I think that he's going to have the same problem justifying any of his moral beliefs. However, if Johnson can show that his model at least has the built-in resources to in principle account for moral knowledge, and that Wielenberg's theory does not, then even if he has no advantage over Wielenberg when it comes to explaining moral facts, he may yet have an advantage for his overall moral theory. Now, I think that this argument which he has offered is problematic, because I think that it relies upon epistemic externalism. As a brief reminder, epistemic externalists do not believe that one needs to be aware of the reasons which justify their beliefs, just as long as certain external conditions, such as their beliefs having been reliably produced, are met. Epistemic internalists deny this, maintaining that there is an awareness requirement on justification. Nevertheless, despite my own rejection of externalism, Johnson's argument is not entirely misplaced when it comes to Wielenberg, since Wielenberg himself embraces an externalist epistemology. As I have argued in my video on internalism and externalism, I think that all externalist theories of knowledge entail global skepticism. So while I agree with Johnson that Wielenberg's epistemology leaves him stuck in skepticism, this is because he embraces externalism, not because he embraces atheism. It seems clear to me, however, that an atheist could embrace Wielenberg's moral ontology while rejecting Wielenberg's moral epistemology, and could opt for an internalist theory of moral knowledge. If this is possible, then Johnson won't have any necessary advantage over Wielenberg when it comes to moral epistemology either. However, to show that this is possible, I will have to confront Johnson's argument and show how the internalist can escape the conclusion. Students of philosophy will note the similarities between Johnson's argument and Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. Johnson has merely taken Plantinga's argument and applied it to metaethics. While the first premise of Johnson's argument is, and has been, hotly debated among philosophers ever since Plantinga first proposed it, I am happy enough to grant it for the sake of argument. I would just agree that the probability of our cognitive faculties being reliable given atheism and evolution is low. Instead, my criticisms will focus upon the second and third premises of the argument. I disagree with the second premise. I do not believe that if someone sees that the probability of their cognitive faculties being reliable given atheism and evolution is low, then they necessarily have a defeater for their belief that their cognitive faculties are reliable. This is because any non-zero probability can be overcome by sufficient evidence. So if we were to be in possession of sufficient evidence that our cognitive faculties were reliable, then this would overcome the low prior probability. Now Johnson anticipates this move, but thinks that it is ultimately circular. He says, if someone believes atheism and evolution, and then comes to see that the probability of their cognitive faculties being reliable is low in this scenario, it wouldn't be possible for them to use arguments or evidence to try to prove their cognitive faculties are reliable. Such attempts would fail because to even begin such a move, they'd have to first assume their cognitive faculties were reliable, which is the very issue under consideration.
So one of the ways that he tries to defeat Plantinga's argument is he says, look at the evidence. I mean, it seems that our cognitive faculties are very reliable. And he gives examples of that, and he says, even though Plantinga's argument concludes that they're not reliable, if evolution and naturalism were correct, however, when we look at the evidence, we see that our cognitive faculties are very reliable. And you know where I'm going with this, and a lot of people have pointed this out already, that's very circular, because he's using to evaluate the accuracy of his cognitive faculties. What is he using? He's using his cognitive faculties. And so he's using the very thing that's under question. Mm-hmm. He's using the very thing that is potentially defeated, or that we're wondering if they're reliable or not, in order to prove their reliability. And so that fails.
Now, I should note the irony of objecting to someone using circular reasoning to escape a Plantinga-style argument when Plantinga himself thinks that all of our beliefs, and even God's beliefs, are ultimately based upon circular reasoning. But more fundamentally, I don't agree with Johnson that this response to his argument involves circular reasoning. Why would one have to assume that their cognitive faculties were reliable in order to marshal arguments or evidence in support of that proposition? Remember what cognitive faculties are supposed to be. They are our belief-forming faculties. They are the source of our beliefs. It seems to me that Johnson's conclusion only follows if one thinks that beliefs are justified in virtue of having been produced by a reliable cognitive faculty and by nothing else. To see why, consider how an acquaintance theorist might inductively reach the conclusion that their belief sources are reliable. Remember that Johnson is discussing sources of belief and not sources of justification. The two need not be coextensive. For the acquaintance theorist, a belief is non-inferentially justified when one is acquainted with their belief, the fact to which their belief corresponds, and the relation of correspondence between their belief and the fact. Notice that whatever source produces this belief, whether reliable or otherwise, plays no role in the justification of that belief. Now suppose that the non-inferential beliefs produced by one's belief sources are consistently accompanied by the three acquaintances necessary for non-inferential justification. Based upon this, one could make an inductive inference on the basis of the continued accuracy of their belief source to the conclusion that their belief source is reliable, in the sense that it consistently forms beliefs which are true. Again, this would be justified by the three relevant acquaintances. In no way would such a track record argument be circular, because at no point would it depend upon the premise that one's cognitive faculties are reliable. To reach his desired conclusion, namely that if someone sees that the probability of their cognitive faculties being reliable is low, then they have a defeater for their belief that their cognitive faculties are reliable, Johnson would need to add the premise that a belief is only epistemically justified if it has been produced by a reliable cognitive faculty. However, once the necessary premise to draw Johnson's desired conclusion has been added, the acquaintance theorist will just reject it. There is no reason to grant the assumption that the reliability, or lack thereof, of a source which produced a belief is relevant to the epistemic justification for that belief. As Timothy and Lydia McGrew observe, it is interesting to see how stubborn is the notion that everyone, internalists included, must acknowledge the need for a general reliability requirement of some sort for positive epistemic status. It may be true, as we have already discussed, that a particular set of sufficient conditions for internalist justification, for example, being infallibly non-inferentially known, also satisfies a very broadly understood version of a trustworthy source requirement. But the internalist should staunchly insist that coming from a trustworthy, i.e. reliable, source is neither necessary nor in general sufficient for justification. It is not necessary, for an internalist can take a belief to be justified if its source does not in any sense tend to produce true beliefs. It is not sufficient because all of the external conditions one could add neither constitute nor entail that a belief has internalist rationality. And this objection, which I have presented to the second premise, should make it clear why I also reject the third premise that if someone has a defeater for the reliability of their cognitive faculties, then they have a defeater for any belief produced by their cognitive faculties. This premise, once again, assumes that the justification for a belief in some way is determined by the reliability of the processes which produce it. But the internalist need not accept such an assumption. Consider a cognitive faculty which is usually unreliable. It produces false beliefs much more frequently than it does true beliefs. Now suppose that it produces a belief which happens to be true. Moreover, suppose that I am acquainted with the truth maker of that belief, as well as the correspondence relation which holds between that belief and the fact which makes it true. In such a case, I have a justified belief, even though the source of the belief is fundamentally unreliable. This is because the justification of that belief is being yielded by acquaintance rather than by the reliability of the cognitive faculty which produced it. Richard Fumerton correctly observes, Plantinga and many other externalists are, ironically, forced to take such evolutionary debunking arguments more seriously than the more traditional epistemologist would. The traditional epistemologist will distinguish the causal origins of a belief from the question of whether or not there is available justification to support that belief. The traditional epistemologist recognizes a genetic fallacy with respect to both claims about truth and claims about justification. As a philosopher, I've always thought I should ignore completely Freudian, Marxist, feminist, right-wing, left-wing, or any other psychological theories about why I came to believe what I believe. I don't really care why I came to believe what I believe. I care whether I can find something that would justify me in holding my belief. But the externalist typically can't divorce these causal questions from philosophical questions because all of the critical epistemic concepts are defined in terms of a belief's genesis. I see no reason why an atheist cannot adopt Wielenberg's metaphysical account of moral realism while rejecting Wielenberg's admittedly problematic moral epistemology, provided that one takes themselves to have justification for their moral beliefs on internalist grounds, then they can adopt Wielenberg's moral theory and propose it as the best explanation of morality. Johnson's showing problems with Wielenberg's externalist moral epistemology will not block this move. Therefore, this problem with Wielenberg's epistemology does not provide any reason to think that theism better explains morality than does Platonism. In summary, I think that Johnson's moral theory is highly sophisticated, which enables him, to one degree or another, to evade my first three challenges. However, despite valiant efforts on his part, I do not think that he overcomes the fourth. In this video, we have surveyed 5 challenges facing any moral argument. We have examined 4 attempts to get around the first challenge and concluded that none of them succeeds. We have examined 4 more attempts to get around the last 4, and while some of these attempts succeeded better than others in getting around certain challenges, we found that none of them were able to get around all 4. I take these 5 challenges collectively to be, as a whole and at present, intractable for moral arguments for theism, and that is why I avoid using moral arguments in building my own case for theism.